Titanic sank on April 14, 1912, and all of the passengers' belongings and ship's paraphernalia went down into the deep, dark waters with it. These objects patiently waited to be discovered until 1985. Titanic sank fast, and there seemed to be almost nothing left from the ship. Yet divers in small submarines managed to retrieve plenty of artifacts from the wreckage. If you wonder what those surprising items look like, hey, join me. A number of museums have collections of Titanic items rescued by divers or donated by survivors and their relatives. And some of those items are even sold at auction. So if you're ready to spend a pretty penny on an exclusive artifact, hey, why not? The first artifact on my list is a pocket watch belonging to a Titanic passenger, John Chapman. John and his wife Elizabeth were on their honeymoon. When the ship hit the iceberg, Elizabeth was offered a seat on a lifeboat next to her friend Emily Richards. There was a problem, though. Mr. Chapman couldn't enter the lifeboat. Elizabeth turned to her friend Emily and said, "Farewell. If John can't go, I won't go either." Now, that's what I call true love. After a short time, the ship went under. If we step back and return to Chapman's pocket watch, we'll notice one more heartbreaking detail. Experts believe the watch stopped around the time the ship finally submerged. Do you remember the iconic scene in the Titanic movie where the ship's band continued to play while the ship was sinking? The violin, played by the real musician, was sold in an auction for $1.7 million in 2013. They say the band played Nearer My God to Thee as the ocean liner sank. Since we started talking about the band, we might as well shed light on a piece of music found on the ship. It was the song "Put Your Arms Around Me, Honey." Considering the fact that paper gets ruined almost instantly when it meets with water, it's a miracle to see those documents. Another saved paper document is the lunch menu. The first-class passengers wore their beautiful dresses and enjoyed their meals without knowing that it was their last lunch. This unique item was auctioned for $122,000. Meals were offered based on class. For instance, a first-class passenger would eat roasted turkey with cranberry sauce, spring lamb, or baked haddock. In comparison, a third-class lunch consists of stuff like rice soup, fresh bread, roast beef, and brown gravy. There were also cabin biscuits, which the passengers would eat to diminish seasickness. It wasn't just the menu. A VIP ticket was also retrieved. The ticket number is still readable, 1342. Number 5 is Edwardian perfume samples. A chemist named Adolf Saalfeld stepped onto the Titanic with various perfume bottle samples. Why did he bring these samples with him? Well, Saalfeld planned to open a fragrance store in America. 61 vials of perfume sank with the ship. Luckily, their owner managed to survive and get there safely, but his samples sank and were only rediscovered some time ago by the divers. When we accidentally drop a plate, it usually shatters into pieces. Now, there's a question. Do you think an unbroken plate can be recovered from Titanic? The answer is yes. Original White Star Tableware is proof. Apparently, each class of passengers didn't just get different meals, but was also served with different types of plates. The retrieved plates have a green and brown floral motif. The edges have a gold rim, and there's a logo in the center. By the way, they're sold at auction, and you can find them online. Let's carry on with touching personal stories. The love story of Rose and Jack that we see in the movie is fictional, but the ship surely witnessed many romantic tales. Here's a love letter to prove this. The messages tell us a story about how life was on the ship during the last few days. It was written by Kate Buss on April 10th. She mentioned how seasick she felt and other things, such as she was supposed to go to dinner in a half an hour. This letter wasn't the only letter divers took to the surface. For example, there's the letter Esther Hart wrote to her little daughter Ava. It was sold at auction for £119,000. This letter is probably the last letter written on board, since it was completed only 8 hours before the tragedy. The letter is not that damaged because it was in the pocket of Esther's husband's coat. Another letter we can mention is Dr. John Simpson's letter. Those words were the last words that he wrote to his mother. Let me introduce you to Edith Rosenbaum. She was on the ship with her lucky toy pig. Edith had been severely injured in an accident before she sailed on the big ship. The toy was a present from her mother as moral support for her recuperation process. It was actually a music box in the shape of a pig. Edith used it to calm frightened young people in the same lifeboat. The next item on the list is the scout whistle of Lillian Bentham. She was a second-class passenger. On that terrible night, Lillian was in her stateroom. She didn't believe that the Titanic could sink. After all, it was the unsinkable ship. Her friend came to her and convinced her to hop into a lifeboat. Only then did she realize how serious the situation was. Moments later, she saw the ship break into two parts. As the lifeboat floated into the night, Lillian saw a crewman who was also rescued. Without a second thought, she wrapped the man with her fur coat. It was freezing, so she probably saved the man's life by doing that. The young man wanted to thank her for her kindness, so he gave Lillian a scout whistle. It was the whistle he used throughout the night to call for help. This pair of white gloves is one of the rarest artifacts recovered from Titanic. These cotton gloves belong to a gentleman. The owner's identity is unknown. Fabric can't last underwater for decades, but these gloves look fine, and you can still see the fine detailing and elegance. An alarm bell has also been found. Yes, that's the famous bell, the one that rang to warn people about the iceberg. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were on lookout duty the night of the accident. Both of them survived. Fleet was the one who saw the iceberg before the ship struck it. What's ironic is that Fleet and Lee didn't have access to binoculars. They were stored in a locker in the crow's nest, but the key to the locker was in the pocket of a crew member who was reassigned to another ship at the last minute and didn't leave the key. They could have seen the iceberg sooner if they had had pairs of binoculars. If they had had it, the Titanic could have gotten out of the way. Divers discovered not just belongings of passengers or the crew, but also pieces belonging to the ship itself. Our next artifact is the Grand Staircase. Some parts of this iconic structure are recovered from the wreck. Turns out that this staircase became a meeting spot among first-class passengers. If they wanted to visit the Turkish baths for a spa day or eat dinner, they met at the staircase and went together. This staircase was a sign of how luxurious some parts of Titanic were. Another miraculously saved object that belongs to the ship is its plan. It was one of the most expensive artifacts sold at auction. The plan is around 30 feet wide. What else? The logometer was also discovered. It's a device used to check the sailing speed of the ship and the distance it covers. The experts say that from the start at noon on April 14th, the device logged 268 nautical miles. And there's more. A giant chunk of hull, known as the Big Piece, was also found. This fellow weighs 15 tons. The larger portholes were for the cabins, and the smaller ones were for the restrooms. This piece was found in 1994, but it was in 1998 when it was successfully taken out. After all these years spent underwater, it was swarming with sea life. Still surprisingly, the portholes still had glass. Now, let's assume you were a diver and you could only take out one of these objects. Which one would you pick? It was September 12, 1990. In those times, way before instant messaging and Zoom calls, a little girl was looking for pen pals. Zoe was aboard a ship from England to Belgium on vacation with her parents. She was only 10 years old at the time, but was a very clever schoolgirl. She took a piece of paper and started putting some words together. She introduced herself,
Hello.
then wrote about how she liked ballet and playing the flute and the piano. Of course, she couldn't help but mention her two adored pets, a little hamster she called Sparkle and her fish Speckle. She also put down the address at which she could be reached in case someone was interested in writing back to her. But alas, she was at sea. Who could she send this message to? An interesting idea came to her mind. She carefully placed her letter in a plastic bottle, tightly closed the lid to protect it from the water, and threw it into the sea. The little girl's excitement faded away over the years as she didn't receive a response. Maybe the bottle got stuck somewhere. Maybe it was swallowed by some big, scary sea creature. Or maybe the water actually poked through the plastic cap and destroyed her message. Many years later, on Christmas, a letter for Zoe was received at her parents' house under her maiden name. The postage signaled that the message was from Europe. It was from a Dutch couple, Piet and Jacqueline Lateau, who had found her delicate bottle and were very considerate to write back. They pointed out that they had found the letter among the debris thrown at the shore by the sea. Zoe's letter had been stranded for a staggering 23 years at sea and traveled for more than 350 miles to reach its final destination near Rotterdam in the Netherlands. That's quite a voyage for a small plastic bottle. A story similar to that of Zoe is the strange connection between two little boys. A little German boy named Frank Uzbek was on a boat traveling to Denmark when he got the same idea as Zoe. He was 5 years old at the time he put together a message and threw it into the unknown. The year was 1987. He got his response years later when he was 29. His letter, just like the one Zoe would send a couple of years later, had been at sea for 24 years. His message was found by a boy named Daniel Korotkin while he was on a walk with his parents on the Koronian Spit near the Baltic Sea. Daniel was lucky that his father knew enough German to translate the message. The unlikely friends eventually met via video call in 2011. Not all message-in-a-bottle stories have been explained away. In 2013, a Croatian surfer came across a damaged bottle while near the Adriatic Sea. The message it contained dated back to 1985, and it was from a man named Jonathan. The sender was eager for his letter to reach a woman named Mary, and he also expressed his keenness for her to respond. Since the letter was supposedly sent from Nova Scotia, the bottle had to have traveled a mind-boggling 3,700 miles. The message went from the Atlantic Ocean, entered the Mediterranean Sea, and reached the Adriatic shores in Croatia. The identities of neither John nor Mary were ever discovered. There are also messages in a bottle with wonderful love stories to share. This was the case for Ake and Paulina Viking. When Ake, a lonely Swedish sailor, placed a letter in a bottle and threw it in the Mediterranean Sea, he had no idea the piece of paper would eventually reach his future wife. This was in the early 1950s. The bottle was found by an Italian man who was inspired enough to give it to his niece, Paulina. After a year of back-and-forth letters being exchanged, Ake and Paulina eventually met and got married. Having decided to share their story with the world, they became somewhat of a celebrity couple for the time. They even shared video footage of their wedding with the world, and their story was featured in a bunch of newspapers. This fortunate event started a movement between young people looking for love, increasing the number of messages being thrown out at sea in search of a fairy tale ending. Not all the stories that started out like this eventually worked out, though. In 1945, an American named Frank Hayostak placed a similar message to that of Ake's in a bottle and threw it in the waters. Almost a year later, his letter was found by an Irish woman. Her name was Brenda O'Sullivan. Their years of correspondence soon caught the attention of the media at the time, but their friendship never flourished because of the added pressure. They eventually met in person when Frank traveled to Ireland, but he didn't stay for long, and they eventually got out of touch with each other. After Titanic met its strange ending, many bottles containing secret messages started to surface. Almost all of them proved to be counterfeited, apart from one letter. Years after Titanic had sunk in the icy Atlantic waters, a bottle was found on the Irish shores. It was supposedly from a man named Jeremiah Burke, and to this day, it is considered to be the only genuine message in a bottle originating from Titanic. The piece of paper simply stated the sender's name and the location, the Titanic, accompanied by the word goodbye. Since the date has washed away, it's difficult to estimate whether the note was sent before or after the ship had hit the iceberg. The common understanding is, however, that since Jeremiah was looking to relocate to the U.S., he was merely sending his last symbolic regards to his family and friends back in Ireland. This simple way of meeting and sometimes corresponding with people has turned into a hobby for a man from a Canadian province named Prince Edward Island, located east of the U.S. state of Maine. This man, Harold Hackett, claims to have sent over 4,000 bottles into the Atlantic Ocean since 1996. He also claims to have received many responses from all over the world, including letters from people in Europe, like France and Germany, but also from the Bahamas or even Africa. This unlikely pastime earns him about 150 Christmas cards from his pen pals each year. To this day, he refuses to add his phone number to any of his letters. This way, he ensures that if people ever want to contact him, the only means of doing so is via a written letter. He's also studied the best times to send the messages in the water based on the direction of the winds and the currents. Now, some bottles spend a whole lifetime at sea after being cast away by their sender. It was the case for a British man that wrote a message and placed it into a bottle before throwing it in the English Channel in 1914. His name was Thomas Hughes, and he wanted to direct the message to his wife, but was polite enough to write a letter to whoever got their hands on the bottle first, asking them to redirect the piece of paper accordingly. The bottle didn't reach his wife, since it was found 85 years later on the Essex coast. The man that stumbled upon the bottle was kind enough to reach out to the family and place the message in possession of Thomas's daughter. And 85 years isn't the longest time for a small bottle to be cruising the waves. A scientist named Hunter Brown was studying currents in the North Sea when this idea came to his mind. He placed the same message in almost 2,000 bottles and requested the unlikely recipient that they write back with the location of their discovery. He thought this method would help him better understand the layout of the North Sea currents. A bottle was found about 11 miles from its original departing location after 97 years. To this day, more than 300 of the original bottles relating to Hunter Brown's project eventually made it to the shore. Not all of the messages that were found in bottles got replied to via physical letters. Oliver van de Walle threw a bottle containing a letter on the English coast while he was on vacation with his family. He was 14 at the time. 33 years later, a woman reached out on Facebook claiming she had gotten his message and tracked him down through his social media profile. At first, he hardly remembered having placed the letter in the bottle, but he eventually recounted the events, even the fact that he sealed the bottle with candle wax to make sure it was leak-proof. And then there's Christina Aguilera and her bottle. No wait, hers is about a genie in a bottle. Okay, never mind.
Have you ever wondered how much of the Titanic is left these days? Now, if you haven't been living under a rock, you probably know that it's been over 100 years since the world's most famous ship turned into a wreck. The RMS Titanic, the world's largest sea liner from the beginning of the 1900s, sank during its maiden voyage, just a few days after leaving port. The ship struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912, taking down over 1,500 passengers of more than 2,200 who were on board the liner at that time. As shocking as this may sound, the Titanic took over 3 years to be built and only 3 hours to sink. And if it were today, the ship would have cost over $210 million to be made. It was last seen on the surface of the Atlantic at 2:20 a.m., and for many decades, that was the last time people saw it. It wasn't until 1985 that the whereabouts of the ship were discovered by oceanographer Robert Ballard, and some parts of the Titanic became visible once again. One of the first discoveries made by Ballard's expedition was that the ship was indeed torn in half before sinking. The early exploratory missions to the part of the ocean floor where the Titanic now lies could only see the hull and the deck of the ship. According to Ballard, the main purpose of these missions was to understand how to preserve the ruins from deteriorating. Another goal was to recover the huge number of personal items scattered along the seabed. The explorer later said the view down there was as shocking as it was emotional. In the field of debris around the wreck, the oceanographer discovered plenty of small objects and personal belongings, many of which he brought back to the surface. There were shoes, some fancier than others. There were pieces of clothing that belonged to crew members. And there were huge propellers. If on the surface they gleamed and shined, on the ocean floor they were embedded and devoured by sand. Ballard pointed out that the area where kitchenware was scattered measured more than a mile in length. There were enough plates, pots, and pans to fill up an entire industrial kitchen. For the first time ever, 3D animation footage reveals exciting images. The simulations show the Titanic's evolution from when she first set sail in 1912 until the state of her ruins today. But simulations weren't enough for deep-sea explorer James Cameron, who envisioned traveling to the heart of the wreck for the first time ever in the history of the ship. Yep, the same James Cameron who happens to be the director of a very famous movie about the ship. He has now dived 33 times to visit the wreck of the Titanic. Here's some fun trivia for you. The director says that his true passion has always been the ocean, and that ever since he was a kid, he wanted to study the sea. Directing, let's say, just happened to be his day job. And when the possibility of directing Titanic appeared, he said yes, just so that he could go and check out the ruins of the ship in real life. Now back to the wreck. According to James Cameron, it wasn't enough for researchers to access only the exterior of the ship. They needed to go inside, analyze and photograph what was left of the pompous interiors of the world's once biggest sea liner. Cameron piloted an innovative robot vehicle equipped with cameras. It helped the man to reveal spaces in the Titanic that no one had ever seen before since the ship touched the bottom. Turkish baths, for instance, still had their tiled walls standing up almost in all their entirety. These baths were exclusively for first-class passengers. They were located right next to the swimming bath and the third-class dining room, and were designed in the Moorish style. People resting there could get heating blankets and ask waiters to bring them anything they needed. If the pictures from before the disaster were astonishing, they carry a different kind of wow factor now, when everything you see in them is hidden underneath the surface of the water. Another shocking discovery was the ship's mast. If we look at the Titanic in its pre-sinking glory, the mast calls much of one's attention. Located on the bow of the huge ship, the mast held together the transmission cables for the Marconi system, a system of wireless telegraphy. That's also where the British merchant flag the Titanic flew was located. The mast stood at the height of a bit more than 100 feet and was equipped with a crow's nest. Nowadays, the mast is unrecognizable. Attacked by corrosion, it collapsed. The crow's nest broke apart too. Now we can see why the modern-day Titanic is a real treasure for deep-sea explorers. But as the wreck of the ship lies at an approximate depth of 12,500 feet, sunlight is non-existent there. So, piloted missions depend on high-end technological equipment to survey the area. Why do you think the Titanic went missing from the public eye for over 70 years? Well, because at that time, technology wasn't advanced enough for people to go down there, as well as bring back good footage of the wreck. Filmmakers were the ones who drove this technology to its advance by trying to film underwater. They began by building boxes to put their cameras inside. And now, deep-sea photography is highly advanced and allows us to marvel at the awesomeness of underwater life. Of course, taking pictures under the sea is no easy feat. For one thing, to withstand that crazy underwater pressure, submarines need to be really strong and have thick walls, no thinner than 11 inches. Plus, explorers need to understand how to film and photograph when there's almost no light around. There was another thing that made documenting the Titanic even more difficult. When the wreck of the ship was rediscovered by scientists, it was covered with red-colored rusty bacteria that made it even harder to take good pictures. As it happens, the color red does not reflect well underwater, which is unfortunate for photographers. For this reason, human-operated vehicles that go down to tour the ruins are equipped with powerful lighting devices. When you see some parts of the ship from afar, they look as if reddish-brown wax has been dripping all over the Titanic's ruins. But in reality, these icicle-shaped structures are colonies of microorganisms. When the ship sank, it brought down with it an enormous amount of bacteria that hadn't existed at the bottom of the ocean before. But now, these bacteria, together with the extreme conditions at the bottom of the ocean, have turned into a disastrous combination for the ruins of the ship. These red colonies of microorganisms actually feed off of iron and steel, which is basically all that is left of the Titanic. One kind of those microorganisms are bacteria called Halomonas titanicae. They can eat up to 220 pounds of iron per day. This makes the Titanic a colossal food source for them. There have been lots of speculations regarding the life expectancy of the ship's wreck after researchers discovered this bizarre rust. But according to Cameron and his research team, the Titanic isn't going to disintegrate anytime soon. In one of the latest expeditions down to the wreck, a piloted vehicle was funded to identify specifically one stateroom. It belonged to a very important passenger, Sir Benjamin Guggenheim. Yes, just like the museum. Guggenheim was the son of a mining magnate and a member of the elite group that boarded the transatlantic journey of the Titanic. Born in Philadelphia, Guggenheim was traveling back home to the U.S., but as we all know, he never made it to his final destination. For the price that ranged from 400 to 800 pounds back in 1912, the equivalent of 84,000 pounds nowadays, one could book accommodation that was called a stateroom. Staterooms on the Titanic were the most luxurious kind of first-class rooms. They were located on the B or C decks and were decorated in more than 11 different styles, ranging from Jacobean, Georgian, Italian Renaissance, and the list goes on. These rooms were filled with carved paneling and marquetry made from exotic and rare kinds of wood, such as mahogany, oak, and so on. Guggenheim occupied one of these luxurious rooms, and 100 years later, one of his descendants funded an entire mission just to locate the precise stateroom the man stayed in. This expedition turned into a documentary for National Geographic, and they did manage to identify which stateroom was Guggenheim's, so kudos for them. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic made contact with an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. Many artifacts were found and restored, like parts of the ship, jewelry, and dining plates, to name a few. It took approximately 3 hours for the ship to be completely submerged in the remote icy water. The night was cold and very much alive. The orchestra was playing music as they enchanted the guests on board. Everyone was excited to arrive in America. It was still considered an amazing feat for a ship to cross the Atlantic back in 1912. But as the day went ahead, there was an atmosphere of impending doom for the captain and his crew. No one else felt it though. It seemed to them nothing could possibly go wrong, and this would just be another regular night. To them, the Titanic was unsinkable. The last thing on your mind when thinking about the Titanic is the mail crew. Yes, there were mailmen on board delivering mail to America. It may seem like a pretty mundane occupation, but there was a very tough test to pass in order to be accepted on board, and only a few top candidates would qualify, and those few would get shortlisted and accepted. John Starr March, an American, was one of these mailmen earning between $1,000 to $1,500 a year working on the Titanic. Back in 1912, this was considered to be a lot of money. They were not officially part of the ship's crew, since the mail crew was placed near the third-class quarters. But given their influence and resistance, they were eventually moved and given a private dining area. March got this job since he needed the money to support his family. He found a perfect way to earn some big bucks, working on a large ship traveling across the ocean. He was 51 at the time and came from New Jersey. Sadly, he was on board when the ship sank and didn't make it. But they recovered a pocket watch that gives us a little insight into what happened that fateful evening. It's a gold case engraved with filigree and had a caption saying it was made by the Elgin National Watch Company. On the surface, you'd think this would just make a pretty cool antique sitting over the fireplace, but there are some unusual details about it. There are obvious signs water seeped beneath the glass, and the black arms of the watch indicate the time to be exactly 1:27. It leaves us wondering why the clock stopped at this precise hour. What was the owner doing? The mail clerks were operating a fully functioning and efficient mail sorting facility on board the Titanic. This wasn't something you'd come by often on a cruise ship, since typical ocean liners use closed mail bags to transport the mail from one port to another. But the mail sorting facility on the Titanic allowed passengers to send out postcards whenever the ship docked in transit zones in Ireland and France. According to reports, people started heading back to their rooms at around 11 p.m., but some of them were still hanging around and enjoying their night. The 5 mailmen were celebrating a colleague's birthday in their separate dining room. 5 minutes before impact, crew members spotted the iceberg and rang the bell 3 times as a warning that something was ahead of the ship. They gave orders for the Titanic to move left, or, as they say in the biz, hard a starboard, to make the engines reverse. It was not enough to avoid the great impact. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg, and disaster erupted on the inside. Not just water seeping in and ultimately sinking the ship, but panic and chaos among the passengers and crew members. Captain Smith reached the deck and was informed that the Titanic had hit an iceberg. And at the same time, the mailroom began filling with water. We know that the 880-foot ship was completely submerged at around 2:20 a.m., with 706 survivors. The time between the impact and the sinking was really eventful. At midnight, they started getting the lifeboats ready for the passengers to evacuate. Orders were given for women and children to board the safety boats with some crewmen to guide and operate them. The problem was that the 20 safety boats available could only host 1,178 people out of the total of more than 2,200 passengers on board. March and his colleagues began sorting out the mail. There was chaos in directing and ordering around. With each second passing, icy cold water was filling the ship. 15 minutes after midnight, Captain Smith ordered his crew members to send out a distress signal. Even though SOS was established earlier than the Titanic, many others used CQD. The CQ stands for General Call, and the D is Distress. The Frankfurt was too far away to help, even though it was one of the first to respond. Even the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, responded, but it also was too far away. At 12:20 a.m., the Carpathia received the urgent message and redirected from its original course to help them out, even though they were 58 nautical miles away. Although this was some relieving news, the water kept seeping in at an alarming rate. It wasn't easy to keep everyone calm, knowing that the ship could be underwater in a matter of hours. At this point, many passengers were already on board the safety boats, waiting to descend into the water. The musicians on board began playing music for the ones still waiting. At first, they were playing in the first-class lounge, and then they moved to the deck. There's a debate on how long they were playing for, and what song it was. None of the musicians made it out. The 5 mailmen on board were also doing their duties while the ship was sinking. According to a ship officer, the mailroom was already covered in water above the ankles, and the mailmen were busy trying to save as much mail as they could. March was one of them. There were bags of mail floating around. They started with the registered mail. Witnesses of the Titanic sinking reported the mailmen were putting bags of mail on the deck to keep them from getting wet until help arrived. They also mentioned bags of mail were floating about in the freezing water. It wasn't until 12:45 a.m. when lifeboat number 7 on the left side of the ship was lowered onto the water. Even though it had room for roughly 65 people, only 27 people were inside. Many of the safety boats carried fewer passengers than their maximum capacity allowed. The crew were worried that the boats would capsize if so many people were on them. Some reports suggest that some people even refused to board the safety ships, sticking with the claim that the Titanic was unsinkable. At the same time, they fired up one of the 8 distress rockets in the air, but it didn't get them any help. At 12:55 a.m., the second and third safety boats were descended to the waters with 2 male passengers jumping on board. 5 minutes later, another safety boat was lowered with around 39 people. At this point, water entered the base of the grand staircase. In the next 20 minutes, more safety boats were lowered, most of them underloaded. Still no help. The Carpathia was still on the way. Panic was growing, and tensions were rising. There was a lot of anger for people being left behind. At around 1:30 a.m., things were getting out of control. The organized boarding of passengers to the safety boats stopped. March's watch stopped 3 minutes earlier, which could mean he was part of the scuffle between crew members and passengers. It took 3 hours for the Carpathia to arrive. March wasn't among the survivors. His watch proved to be one of the essential findings lost in the wreckage of the Titanic. It was eventually returned to March's 2 daughters, and now it's in one of the collections of the National Postal Museum. March was a man who did what he had to do in the worst circumstances. Time was a precious commodity for the people on board the ship, and this watch proved valuable to learn more about the tragic yet inspiring stories of the Titanic. It was the start of 1912. A giant chunk of ice broke off a glacier in southwest Greenland. The ice was made up of snow that had fallen thousands of years before the event, perhaps as far back as when mammoths still roamed the earth. The iceberg started its journey. It was a huge thing, more than 1,700 feet long and weighing over 75 million tons. It was also a very peaceful chunk of ice. It steered clear of ships and busy transport routes. And then, it somehow floated much further south than other bergs did. Our iceberg was lucky. Others melt long before they get to these low latitudes. Out of up to 30,000 icebergs that drift away from Greenland's glaciers, only 1% ever make it all the way to the Atlantic. Even after melting into the water for months, this massive block of ice was still almost twice as heavy as the Golden Gate Bridge. The iceberg's top part was towering 10 stories over the ocean surface. Several days before our iceberg made it to the Atlantic Ocean, a magnificent ship left port. It was a luxury liner carrying more than 3,000 passengers and crew members. At that time, it was the largest ship ever built. It was the Titanic. The collisions happened on April 14th, when the ship was in the North Atlantic, 370 miles away from Newfoundland. Unable to divert its course, the ship ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. They started to fill with water at an alarming speed. The Titanic's compartments weren't capped at the top. That's why the water spilled over and started to flood each succeeding one. The front of the ship began to sink, causing the back part to lift vertically into the air. And then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what happened to the iceberg after that? On April 15th, the German ocean liner SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing through the North Atlantic. It was traveling a few miles away from the place where the Titanic had sunk several hours prior. The German ship's chief steward, who hadn't learned about the disaster yet, saw an iceberg. What drew his attention was a large streak of red paint going along the iceberg's base. Surprised, the man took a photo of his discovery. He thought the paint meant a ship had hit the iceberg within the past 12 hours. The next person who saw the iceberg and took another photo of it was the captain of a vessel laying deep-sea telecommunication cables. The ship was sent to help in the area where the Titanic had sunk. The captain later claimed the iceberg he'd seen had been the only one in that area, plus the red paint. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots. In 2015, one of these photos sold at auction for over $32,000. And still, experts are unsure whether the image really shows the infamous block of ice. It might be a simple iceberg that had been floating nearby at that time. The great unsinkable ship was gone, sunken to the bottom of the North Atlantic, where it remains to this day. But the iceberg continued on its way, perplexing a few witnesses and slowly melting into the surrounding water. It would vanish completely before the end of the year.
April 14th, 1912. The Titanic crashed into a huge iceberg and sank. Yep, we've covered that. But what if this time we use the ice to bring the ship to the surface? This requires several thousand feet of wire mesh and a lot of liquid nitrogen. Our goal is to put the Titanic in a huge block of ice that will raise the ship to the surface. Now to do this, you need to wrap the wreck in a wire mesh and cover it with liquid nitrogen. The first problem you face is the inability to wrap the ship completely. You need to somehow lift the ship a little to put the mesh under it. Let's say that by some miracle you manage to do so. Next, you need to transport hundreds of large tanks of liquid nitrogen. You're underwater, opening the tanks, and it's so cold that the icy water of the Atlantic Ocean looks like it's boiling. The nitrogen just sizzles, dissipates, and certainly doesn't create a block of ice around the mesh. Alright, new attempt. Raise the Titanic with the help of huge magnets. For this, you need a large cruiser and some powerful magnets. You attach thick cables to the magnets and lower them to the bottom. Bright projectors illuminate the black ocean depths. Parts of the wreck are visible. The magnets descend lower and cling to the iron hull of the ship. The cruiser pulls the cables and magnets up. Some of them detach from the Titanic as the iron surface is covered with reefs and corals. Some parts of the wreck break away from the ship and rise. The power of the cruiser is not enough. One of the cables is torn. Not only the weight of the individual parts of the Titanic, but also the colossal water pressure interferes with the operation. The sunken ship can't be raised completely, only its small parts. In reality, there has already been an attempt to raise the Titanic in parts. The $5 million operation failed. Nylon slings were attached to a large part of the wreck. The other ends of the slings were connected to the diesel engines. For the entire operation, they used a mini submarine. A piece of the Titanic weighing 21 tons was pulled up, but one of the slings broke because of the strong water pressure. Then, one by one, the other cables began to snap, and a huge piece fell back to the seafloor. By this time, all the participants of the rescue operation had run out of food supplies, and it was far from the nearest shore, so they decided not to make a second attempt. A book was written and a movie was made about how the Titanic was lifted with compressed air. In reality, no one even attempted this operation. To do this, you'd need several hundred large cylinders of compressed air. At first, you install them inside the Titanic's hull and wait for them to pull the ship to the surface. As soon as you lower the cylinders under the water, they immediately float upwards. This greatly complicates the operation. You need to fasten the cylinders with cables and pull them down to the bottom using a powerful submarine, or better yet, several of them. Because of the high pressure, the cylinders might burst. In this case, the blast wave would hit other cylinders and provoke a catastrophe. Too expensive and unsafe. The most expensive and complex plan to raise the Titanic is probably the one where scientists somehow extract hydrogen and oxygen from the ocean water. Then, these extracted elements must fill special containers. Those containers are attached to the ship, and the Titanic would rise to the surface. Even if you extract oxygen and hydrogen from millions of tons of water, the rest of the ocean water will replace it. A machine that will be capable of such filtering should cost billions of dollars. Or you can come up with a chemical element that will use a chain reaction to purify all the water. In this case, the entire world ocean will be left without vital oxygen. Someone once suggested blowing up the Titanic. You'd need to lower several boxes of dynamite to the ocean floor. The boxes must be completely sealed to prevent the dynamite from getting wet. Next, you need to run several miles of wire conducting an electrical current to them. Once all this is done, you sail to a safe distance. Now, you're going to press the button to pass the current through the wire and activate the dynamite. 3, 2, 1, stop! Why would you do this? Even if it works, the wreckage of the Titanic will be scattered in all directions on the seabed. It will be impossible to lift the Titanic from the ocean. Imagine a huge hook that can fetch the Titanic and lift it from the bottom like a fish. This hook must be huge to pick up a sunken ship. Let's say you created it. Next, you're on a huge cruiser, sailing up to the crash site and lowering the hook down like an anchor. It falls right on the Titanic but doesn't cling to it. You need special equipment to attach a bus-sized hook to the Titanic. It would include a huge submarine with mechanical arms. To build such a device and make it work under enormous pressure is already next to impossible. But let's say you finally managed to hook the Titanic. It's then you realize the cruiser doesn't have enough power to lift the ship, weighing more than 50 tons, and the hook that adds about 10 tons more. To complete your task, you'll need a few more cruisers and a few extra $1 million. Once hot wax cools, it hardens and floats on the water surface. What if we deliver it to the ocean floor and pour it inside the Titanic? This may work, given that wax is not an expensive material. So, you melt the wax, pour it into strong tanks, and pull them to the bottom with the help of a submarine. The tanks can withstand enormous pressure, and the submarine has enough power to lower the wax to such a depth. The containers are placed inside the Titanic. Through a remote control, you open the containers, but the wax doesn't pour out. The deeper you go, the colder the water gets. While you were delivering the containers to the ship, the wax was cooling down and getting solid inside. Several containers are pressed against the top of the ship, but it's not enough to lift the Titanic. Other containers simply float away to the surface. And even if the containers were thermostatic and kept hot inside all the time, once released, the wax would solidify in an instant. There would just be no time for it to spread and cover the Titanic from within, so it would just float up as well. Alright, you fill several large and sturdy bags with Vaseline. This substance acts just like wax in the cold. It gets solid and floats. You want to put bags all over the Titanic and just wait for the Vaseline to bring it up. You load the bags into the submarine and descend to the ocean floor. Some parts of the ship can't be reached because of the clinging corals. You decide to unload all the bags in one place, but as soon as you take Vaseline out of the submarine, the bags tear due to the strong pressure. Solid pieces of Vaseline float up, pushed by the water. Mission failed. The craziest idea is to fill the Titanic with millions of ping-pong balls. Small plastic balls filled with air should push the ship to the surface. But as soon as you start to lower them to the bottom, the plastic immediately flattens and all the air from the balls pops out. You can deliver the balls inside a submarine, but once you put them inside the Titanic, the pressure will crush them again. Also, you can create balls made from strong ultralight material and fill them with air. In this case, you will need much more money. As soon as you put the balls inside the ship, some of them will immediately slip through the holes in the ship, and the remaining ones won't be enough to lift the wreck weighing more than 50 tons from the bottom. Well, to study the Titanic, you don't need to go down to the ocean floor. On the internet, you can find a detailed 3D map that shows the wreck site, as well as the ship itself on the seabed. To get a realistic picture of the Titanic, researchers used sonar technologies and underwater robots, which took more than 10,000 pictures of the sunken ship. So, what do you think? Leave it alone? Yeah, me too.
It was the start of 1912. A giant chunk of ice broke off a glacier in southwest Greenland. The ice was made up of snow that had fallen thousands of years before the event, perhaps as far back as when mammoths still roamed the earth. The iceberg started its journey. It was a huge thing, more than 1,700 feet long and weighing over 75 million tons. It was also a very peaceful chunk of ice. It steered clear of ships and busy transport routes. And then, it somehow floated much further south than other bergs did. Our iceberg was lucky. Others melt long before they get to these low latitudes. Out of up to 30,000 icebergs that drift away from Greenland's glaciers, only 1% ever make it all the way to the Atlantic. Even after melting into the water for months, this massive block of ice was still almost twice as heavy as the Golden Gate Bridge. The iceberg's top part was towering 10 stories over the ocean surface. Several days before our iceberg made it to the Atlantic Ocean, a magnificent ship left port. It was a luxury liner carrying more than 3,000 passengers and crew members. At that time, it was the largest ship ever built. It was the Titanic. The collisions happened on April 14th, when the ship was in the North Atlantic, 370 miles away from Newfoundland. Unable to divert its course, the ship ruptured at least 5 of its hull compartments. They started to fill with water at an alarming speed. The Titanic's compartments weren't capped at the top. That's why the water spilled over and started to flood each succeeding one. The front of the ship began to sink, causing the back part to lift vertically into the air. And then, with a deafening roar, the liner broke in half. The rest is history. But what happened to the iceberg after that? On April 15th, the German ocean liner SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing through the North Atlantic. It was traveling a few miles away from the place where the Titanic had sunk several hours prior. The German ship's chief steward, who hadn't learned about the disaster yet, saw an iceberg. What drew his attention was a large streak of red paint going along the iceberg's base. Surprised, the man took a photo of his discovery. He thought the paint meant a ship had hit the iceberg within the past 12 hours. The next person who saw the iceberg and took another photo of it was the captain of a vessel laying deep-sea telecommunication cables. The ship was sent to help in the area where the Titanic had sunk. The captain later claimed The iceberg he'd seen had been the only one in that area, plus the red paint. It wasn't difficult to connect the dots. In 2015, one of these photos sold at auction for over $32,000. And still, experts are unsure whether the image really shows the infamous block of ice. It might be a simple iceberg that had been floating nearby at that time. The great unsinkable ship was gone, sunken to the bottom of the North Atlantic, where it remains to this day. But the iceberg continued on its way, perplexing a few witnesses and slowly melting into the surrounding water. It would vanish completely before the end of the year. April 10th, 1912. You're on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, in a small port town. Hundreds of people, and you among them, are going to board the huge, majestic ship. It's 3 times as long as the Statue of Liberty is tall. The ship is considered the most advanced and unsinkable watercraft of its time. You can see hundreds of luxury cabin windows on its deck, and the Titanic inscription on the magnificent iron hull. This day, the famous superliner set off on its first and last voyage from Southampton to New York. But now, you'll see an alternate story. You can hear a crew member announcing the start of the Titanic's trip. The ship sails from Africa to Bermuda, and the cause of its catastrophe will not be an iceberg at all. For 4 days, Titanic sails through North Atlantic waters. The sun warms the ship so much that during the day, all the passengers sit inside the ship. In the evening, when a cool breeze descends on the ocean, all the people go up on deck to watch the beautiful red sunset. Midnight, April 15th. You're sitting in your cabin reading a book. You're usually asleep at this time, but right now, you're just flipping through page after page. You close the book and look around the cabin. You feel like someone's watching you. You get up and break out into a cold sweat. An inexplicable feeling of anxiety permeates your body and causes goosebumps. You look out the cabin window where the ocean spray is banging the glass, but you can't see anything. There's a thick fog outside. You leave the cabin. In addition to you, several passengers also left their beds because of a heightened sense of danger. They greet you and ask what's wrong, but no one knows. You head to the stairs to go out on the deck to see the situation. At this point, the floor goes out from under your feet. A strong push makes you fall. A rumble reverberates through the Titanic. You get up and see more and more people going out from their cabins. You run up the stairs and meet a crew member. He doesn't tell you anything, but his eyes are wide with fear. You go up on deck and can hardly see anything. A thick, wet fog has settled over the ship. Several passengers are holding their heads as if they have a headache. You see the captain and ask him what happened. The captain admits that he has no idea where you are. You see a compass in his hand. The arrow turns in different directions. It's impossible to determine where exactly the ship is now. Interestingly, there was no such thing as the Bermuda Triangle before 1964, but the first reports of missing ships in this area date back to the middle of the 19th century. Another push. This time you've managed to stay on your feet. It felt like something big just hit the ship. You run to the railing at the edge of the deck and stare overboard. Through the white fog, you notice a huge shark fin. You haven't seen the full size of the shark, but from what you've seen, it must be as long as a train car. The shark swims away, but after a few seconds, you can see its fin again. It quickly approaches the ship and grabs the iron hull with its huge jaws. The deck is shaking. You can hear the grinding of metal. It seems this huge predator just made a hole in the hull. Only one creature on the planet can do this, the Megalodon. It's an ancient marine predator that measured almost 60 feet in length. Megalodon had no competition in the ocean. It was at the top of the food chain. It's believed the shark disappeared millions of years ago, but the ocean is only 5% explored. Here, it's alive and swimming in the mysterious waters of the Bermuda Triangle. Everyone aboard the ship is panicking. People from the lower decks are running upstairs. The Titanic slowly sinks and tilts to the side. Everyone goes to the lifeboats, but no one dares to get in them while the huge ancient monster is around. The ship's bow submerges under the water. You stand on the left side of the deck and see the Megalodon bite off pieces of the iron hull. You shout to the people in the stern section that the Megalodon is busy and they have time to evacuate. The first rescue boats with passengers go down on the water. Some passengers just jump overboard. Fortunately, the water is much warmer than the place where the Titanic actually sank. You put on a life jacket and jump too. The Megalodon attacks the ship and drags it deeper into the water. The smell of the Titanic's kitchen must have attracted it. You find yourself among the ship's flotsam and lifeboats. The fog's finally rising. The starry sky and the moon illuminate the sea's surface. People help you to climb on board a rescue boat. Everyone tries to sail as far away from the sinking ship as possible. You see the huge sharks swimming around the Titanic. At this moment, something distracts it, and the predator goes away. More than half of the ship is already under the surface. The second part looks like a candle sticking out of the water. The ocean is calm, the sky's clear and cloudless, there's no wind. From the side, you see a huge wave growing behind the Titanic. It's about 50 feet high, like a 5-story building. It knocks the ship down as easily as if it was made of paper. The monster wave dissolves in the water as quickly and unexpectedly as it appeared. You've just witnessed a rogue wave. This phenomenon occurs all over the world. Enormous waves suddenly appear, demolish ships, and disappear without a trace. Scientists still can't determine their exact nature, but according to the most popular theory, these waves are formed by kinetic vampirism. Under certain natural conditions, waves accumulate and exchange kinetic energy. Among all the waves out there, there is one vampire wave that absorbs the energy of all the others. When a lot of energy is accumulated, a huge wave grows and splashes it all out. Some believe the frequent disappearance of ships in the Bermuda Triangle occurred because of rogue waves. The people on the boats calm down. Someone sends a flare into the sky. You look at the ocean and see the triangular fin of the Megalodon emerging from the water. It's the size of a sailboat, and it's coming your way. You row the oars as fast as you can. People are screaming and calling for help. There's no chance of escape. The legendary monster is getting closer and closer. The shark's head peeks out from under the surface. It opens its huge maw filled with hundreds of sharp teeth. Each of them is the size of your palm. The boat would fit entirely inside the shark's mouth. It can swallow you whole. The shark stops and closes its mouth at arm's length from the boat. You can see the water bubbling around you. From the ocean depths, several giant tentacles lash out and wrap around the Megalodon. They pull the shark down. You look over the side and see a purple glow with a black circle in the center. Someone on the boat notices it too. People start screaming, "It's looking at us!" a woman shouts. After a second, you get goosebumps, and a shiver runs through your entire body. This purple glow is something's eye, and the black circle is the pupil. The creature that is looking at you right now is so big that the boat seems like a grain of rice to it. It's the Kraken! The giant squid, an ancient monster that sank hundreds of ships, but whose existence has not been proven by anyone yet. Fortunately, the boat you're sitting in is too small to interest the Kraken. You can see its eye moving deeper away. Huge tentacles pull the struggling Megalodon into the depths. An hour passes, and another big superliner arrives at the wreck of the Titanic. All the passengers are rescued. You look back at the calm sea, at the place where the Titanic recently sailed. You climb aboard the rescue ship and promise yourself never to go on a sea voyage again. You sit up on the bed, put your feet down on the floor, and feel the cold water. You quickly run out of the cabin and find yourself in a long corridor. The water is knee-deep. People are putting on life jackets, running toward the stairs. You run after them and find yourself in chaos. Water is everywhere. A woman slips on the stairs and falls. You help her up. People from all sides are pushing you. Everyone is trying to climb the stairs. There's more water behind you. The cabin you've just left is completely flooded. A few more seconds and the water level will rise above your head. Fortunately, everyone manages to get out. The upper deck is breaking. The huge ship is tilted to the side. The sound of breaking wood, the grinding of iron, and the shouts of people mix with the music played on violins by several musicians. You head for the lifeboats and feel like you're climbing a mountain. There are no lifeboats available, but you find a life jacket. The entire bow of the ship has sunk under the water. You're at the very edge of the stern and decide to jump. You wait for the ship to sink deeper into the water so the distance between you and the ocean surface is reduced. You finally jump and find yourself in the icy water. It's 28 degrees Fahrenheit, not enough to freeze the ocean, but sufficient to turn a puddle on the road into ice. You're having a hard time breathing because of the cold. You watch as one of the most majestic, unsinkable ships in history sinks. In 1.5 hours, another liner will arrive and rescue all the survivors. But before that, you have to handle this situation somehow. 90 minutes to survive the night in the icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean, among chaos, screams, and despair. Only one thing can be even worse: sharks. Everyone knows the story of the Titanic. What if the survivors noticed shark fins among the wreckage? Theoretically, it could have happened. Scenario 1. The sounds of the crash and the vibrations in the water could attract great white sharks. They swim in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, where the disaster occurred. They are some of the most dangerous predators on the planet. They're big, fast, strong, and their 300 serrated teeth are sharp as a blade, lined in several rows. And now, you see a few triangular fins sticking out of the water. They quickly circle you and the other people. You grab a floating wooden piece left from the ship to climb on it. The cold temperature shackles your movements, and your hands slip. These sounds attract the sharks. One of the predators stops swimming around and is now heading straight for you. Fear makes your brain shut down, and your instincts start working. You try your best to swim away from the shark as fast as possible. Of course, it's useless to run from a fast shark in the water, but you're still trying. 2 seconds pass, and you feel your heel hitting the shark's nose. The other foot goes into its toothy mouth. You scream, feel the sharp teeth on your leg, and shut your eyes, but nothing happens. After a second, the shark lets you go. Great whites rarely attack humans. If they bite, it's just because they want to test you. The thing is, the shark's favorite food is seal. After a light testing bite, the shark understands that you're not a seal. It simply loses interest in you. But if the shark is hungry, then it won't care what kind of animal you are. Those survivors who are safe in the boat have no reason to fear. The great white won't attack them. The predator can push the boat a little, but only to test it. If there's a fridge with steaks on board and someone decides to feed them to the sharks, then problems will begin. Several predators will push the boat until the steaks fall in the water. The shark is swimming away from you. Then, one of the lifeboats picks you up. You're safe. Soon, another liner will arrive, and you'll find yourself in a warm and cozy place. Scenario 2. If the water was warmer, Titanic survivors could encounter bull sharks. You jump into the water from the sinking ship. The water's not so cold. You can easily swim to the nearest floating door. But you notice a tall triangular fin with a dark tip on the top. Unlike the great whites, these sharks aren't fast. They seem lazy and slow, as if they aren't interested in you. But you still need to climb the door as quickly as possible. Bull sharks are some of the most aggressive in the world. They deliberately create the illusion of slowness so their prey relaxes. At the right moment, they become agile and fast. They're called that because of their short, flattened faces, like bulls have, and their bodies are strong. These predators like to ram their prey or other sharks with their heads. As soon as you climb the door, the bull shark crashes into it and you fall into the water. Fortunately, there's a lifeboat nearby. People get you on board. Several sharks slam into the boat from all sides. It gets scary, but with your combined efforts, you keep the boat afloat. Soon, another liner arrives and scares off the predators using its loud signal and the roar of the engine. That unpleasant scenario is, luckily, impossible. Bull sharks swim only in the warm waters of the ocean. But most often, they can be found in fresh springs, river estuaries, and shallow water. That's why they're so often seen by people near beaches. Always read about the place where you're going to swim before diving in the water. The third and most likely scenario: you jump into the water, it's icy again, and you're having a hard time moving because of the cold. Your life jacket keeps you on the surface perfectly. The lights of the sinking Titanic light up the water a little, and in the black infinite depth, you notice what looks like a large block of stone. An ancient fish, the most majestic shark in the world, is swimming near you. It's a Greenland shark. They swim even in the Arctic waters, so they're not afraid of the cold temperatures of the North Atlantic. This huge predator is bigger than a car. Each year, its length increases by 0.3 inches. You're lucky to see it, as it's one of the rarest sharks in the world. Fortunately, it has a docile nature and will not attack you. The entire kitchen of the Titanic may be floating in the water and attracting these sharks. They're slow, peaceful, and old. The age of the Greenland shark can reach 400 years. This shark is considered adult 150 years after birth. The one you're currently looking at in 1912 may have witnessed the golden age of pirates with sabers, parrots, and eye patches. Arr! And it's quite possible that the same shark that saw the Titanic disaster is still alive in 2021 and slowly wandering the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In all these scenarios, you manage to escape. But if a shark attacks you in the water and there's no boat nearby, then you still have a chance to survive anyway. The main thing is not to panic. Don't splash or make sudden movements so as not to excite the shark. You're wearing a life jacket, so you don't have to move to stay afloat. Do not swim away from the shark, otherwise it'll think that you're its prey. The shark will be swimming around you, so don't lose sight of it. You can slowly swim away to a boat or wooden boards, anything that you can climb. If you're near the shore, then slowly swim towards it until you reach shallow water. After that, you need to quickly run away. But be careful, the shark can even get you out there, so keep your eyes on it at all times. If the shark still attacks you, then you will have to fight for your life. Weak points of the shark are its eyes and gills. Aim for them with your fists and feet.
April 14, 1912. A cold evening somewhere in the North Atlantic. On board the most modern and unsinkable ship, the Titanic, a dinner is held. Two well-dressed men are sitting at one of the tables. One of them is a famous British journalist. He tells his interlocutor an interesting and at the same time terrible story. It all started about 1000 BCE in ancient Egypt. At that time, one woman was born in the city of Thebes. No one knew who she was or what she did, but she had a high social standing. Towards the end of her life, she was proclaimed a priestess in the College of Amen-Ra. Her body was embalmed, placed in a wooden casket, and covered with a massive lid bearing the image of a woman and mysterious inscriptions. She was buried in Thebes along with other people of the upper class. The mummy of this woman lay at rest for almost 3,000 years. The burial place had been carefully hidden. Around the first half of the 19th century, a group of locals accidentally discovered the ancient tomb. They disturbed the peace of the priestess. No one knows exactly what happened that day, but the mummy was removed from the casket and disappeared without a trace. A few decades later, a group of 4 wealthy friends from England came to Egypt for a trip across the upper part of the Nile. First, they went to visit the excavations of the Temple of Amen-Ra near the city of Luxor. There, they found the empty mummy case. It depicted the priestess with dark eyes looking into the void. There was something sinister in her gaze. They didn't know who the case belonged to, but they were so amazed by the beauty and energy of that find that they decided to buy it from the locals. The buyer disappeared the same night before the case was delivered to him at the hotel. Some said they'd seen the man leave the hotel and go towards the desert. No one knew why he did it. No one else saw him afterwards. Another man from the same group took the casket. During their return home, one of the friends was seriously injured. After arriving in London, the new case owner discovered the bank where all his money was placed had gone bankrupt. In one day, the man turned from a wealthy businessman into a beggar. A third friend also experienced the sinister influence of the ancient find. He lost his health, job, and eventually even his life in an accident shortly after returning to London. Before going bankrupt, the owner gave the ancient casket to his sister who lived in London. One of the friends of this woman came into the room, saw the Egyptian artifact, and immediately felt the dangerous energy emanating from it. Then the owner's sister gave the case to a famous photographer. He took some photos and was horrified. According to his words, he saw a real priestess with a human face in the photos. She looked at him with an ominous, icy gaze. No one except the photographer touched the film of the camera. No one changed the photo. Shortly after, the photographer mysteriously went missing. From that point, the story becomes vague. According to one version, the owner's sister gave the artifact to the British Museum. The man who transported the case passed away soon after, and his assistant got into a terrible accident. Another version says that the item from the Egyptian tomb was bought by a rich businessman. After that, 3 members of his family also had an accident, and his house burned down. Convinced the mummy case was cursed, he gave it to the British Museum. The interlocutor listens to the story with such interest that he forgot about dinner, which has gone cold. "How did you know all this?" he asks. The journalist replies he has been studying everything related to the mummy and its owners for several months. He found evidence of all the accidents and put together the full picture. "So, what happened next?" the interlocutor asks. It seems the mummy case should find peace in the museum. The priestess was surrounded by other kings and queens from different times. However, there was no peace. Scientists and ancient languages experts tried to decipher the symbols on the case. They found out that most of the inscriptions meant curses and misfortunes addressed to those who'd dare to disturb the peace of the priestess. Every night, the guards and museum staff heard the knocking coming from the mummy case. The knocking was accompanied by crying and screaming. Also, someone scattered other exhibits all over the hall every night. Everyone soon came to believe that the priestess's spirit continued to use magic forces. Then, one private collector became interested in the case. He bought it from the museum, not for his collection, but to try to expel the spirit of the mummy from the artifact. It's not known in what ways he tried to do this, but he failed. Then, he managed to sell the mummy case to a rich American archaeologist. That guy decided to move the mummy to New York. And what? What happened next? The interlocutor asks with interest. "That's it. End of story," the journalist answers. "What do you mean? What happened to the mummy? Where is it now?" The journalist looks at the interlocutor with some excitement. "She's here. She's on the Titanic," he says. The interlocutor looks scared and confused, but the journalist confirms the sarcophagus is here. He doesn't doubt it because he saw it with his own eyes. After dinner, they go to their cabins. The journalist lies down but can't help thinking about the mummy. He tries to convince himself that everything he has found out about the priestess is a myth. There is no curse. The moment he finally falls asleep, he feels a slight push. A few minutes later, a crew member knocks on his cabin door. He informs that all passengers must go to the upper deck because something has happened to the ship. The journalist goes out into the fresh air and sees a huge crowd of people. There's no panic yet. Someone says that something has happened to the engine. Others say it's just a precaution. The journalist immediately understands everything. The ship is sinking. The priestess did it. In less than an hour, the Titanic completely went underwater. One legend says the priestess influenced the captain of the ship. The crew members didn't dare to put such a valuable cargo in the hold. Therefore, they placed the box with the artifact near the captain's bridge. On that fateful night, the captain decided to look at the casket with his own eyes. After that, his behavior became weird. They said the spirit clouded his mind. When the ship entered the territory filled with icebergs, he refused to slow down, despite the requests of the crew. The sarcophagus may still lie at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean even now, with the priestess finally having found her peace. Okay, this story is nothing more than a legend. There's no record or evidence that the Titanic was carrying any kind of mummy or sarcophagus. The legend appeared a couple of years after the disaster. At that time, there were many theories about what happened to the Titanic. The ship sank because of secret agencies. ETs attacked the Titanic. The Titanic was sunk specifically to get money for the insurance company. Such crazy theories were very popular among audiences. One of these theories was developed by a well-known newspaper. Journalists published an article about the cursed mummy on board the Titanic. The rest picked up the legend, and it became popular. One of the reasons why people believe in such things is hidden in human psychology. Any fake legend tells something secret, things that people don't or shouldn't know about. When a person reads this, they feel special because now they know a terrible secret. This sense of self-importance is the reason for the popularity of conspiracy theories. Well, it is also important to note that all these theories are really interesting. By the way, the mummy from this story actually exists, and it's in the British Museum. More precisely, there's only a wooden lid from the sarcophagus with the image of a woman. It's still unknown who it belonged to. The identity of the last owner is also unknown. It's only known the exhibit was transferred to the museum at the end of the 19th century. There, she was called the Unlucky Mummy. The museum staff reports that it doesn't bring any misfortunes. The screams and knocking from the lid are just a myth. You can come and see the exhibit yourself with your own eyes, if you dare, of course.
Once a famous giant, the largest ship of that time, now two grand pieces lying on the ocean bottom about 2,000 feet apart, torn by the catastrophic collision of time itself. The stern of the Titanic got completely ruined after hitting the ocean floor, but you can still recognize the bow since many interiors were left preserved. There's a type of bacteria found on the ship's rusticles. A rusticle is this brownish formation of rust. It occurs deep underwater when the wrought iron the ship is made of oxidizes. It means the bacteria eat the iron of the Titanic's hull, piece by piece. And it seems they might finish their snack by 2030, way sooner than when anyone would expect the wreck to be gone forever. You may think it would probably be easier to take the wreck out of the water so that we got to keep it, but it would fall apart if anyone tried to do that. It's been in the water for more than 110 years now, and is now so rusty that no one would be able to reconstruct some parts even if we managed to get the ship out of the ocean depths. What do you think? Could any of about 700 people that had survived the sinking of the Titanic hear it hit the ocean bottom? The largest ship that had ever been made till then disappeared literally before their eyes after all. But sound most likely wouldn't have traveled from water to air. We can't hear that well in water because our bodies are not designed to hear in such environments. And although passengers were close to the sinking site, the Titanic still hit the bottom a long distance away, 12,500 feet. There are so many underwater landslides and earthquakes we cannot hear, and they make way more noise than a single ship slamming into the ocean floor. Most vibrations and sounds must have dispersed over a large area. Also, the downblast of water, which many believe hit the Titanic after it had touched the bottom of the ocean, would have pushed back the majority of the potential acoustic vibrations. Plus, the bottom of the ocean is not hard enough to produce such loud noises. Many survivors said they had heard terrifying noises as the Titanic was breaking apart, but none mentioned hearing anything after the ship disappeared below the surface of the water. Some survivors shared how chaotic it was when passengers, mainly women and children, were getting into lifeboats. There weren't enough boats, and still, some of them weren't even filled to their full capacity. No one knew how to react properly in such a situation. The lifeboat drill had been scheduled for the morning before the Titanic hit the iceberg, but for some reason, it got canceled. A giant ocean liner everyone believes is unsinkable takes a trip across the ocean. On its way, it strikes an iceberg and sinks. Yeah, we all know how the story goes. But what's scary is that it's also the plot of The Wreck of the Titan, a novel published in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic went to the ocean bottom or was even constructed. In the novel, the Titan, what a scarily accurate name too, didn't have enough life jackets, vests, and lifeboats for all the passengers on board. It was also the largest ship of that time, almost identical in size to the Titanic, and both the Titan and Titanic sank in April. Dorothy Gibson was an American silent film actress. She was also one of the Titanic passengers. She survived the catastrophe. Right after she came to New York, she started filming Saved from the Titanic. The film was released only 1 month after the ship sank. Dorothy was even wearing the same shoes and clothes she had worn when she had actually been on the ship. The movie was successful, but it got destroyed in a fire, so it only exists in memories, like Jack Dawson. Titanic wasn't all alone in the restless waves of the cold ocean near the iceberg it struck. The SS Californian was relatively close. Their radio was shut off for that night though. At one moment, the crew members noticed mysterious lights in the sky. They immediately went to wake their captain up to tell him, but he issued no orders. Some believed it was just fireworks. They never realized it was actually a call for help. The flares crew members of the Titanic sent off to the sky, hoping someone would notice. By the time the SS Californian got the SOS message, it was already too late. Some say a full moon may have been the reason the iceberg crossed paths with the gigantic ship. A full moon may have caused incredibly strong tides that eventually sent multiple icebergs southward, right when the Titanic was crossing that area. Would you dare to taste cheese from the Titanic? The wreck has been under the ocean surface for more than 100 years now. It took more than 70 years to find it. By that time, most of the food that had gone down together with the ship had, of course, spoiled. But it's possible there's still some of it left. Some foods are protected from decay. For example, cheese. The microbes that turn milk into cheese create special conditions to protect the product from spoiling. Multiple things have survived the Titanic. A handwritten letter where a mother and a daughter wrote to the girl's grandma about the amazing journey they were on together. The letter has been around for more than 100 years and got sold at an auction. A battered pair of white cotton gloves was found in the wreck. Musicians on the Titanic played till the very last moment. Sheet music and one violin were found among the wreckage. The bell one of the crew members rang 3 times to warn there was a very close iceberg on their way. A pocket watch that stopped at 1:45 a.m., the time when the ship went under the water. Perhaps one person could have changed what happened on the Titanic. David Blair was a pretty lucky man. He was supposed to take the spot of the second officer of the Titanic. He was pulled out at the last moment, which eventually saved his life. It was a great thing for him, but something clouded his joy. What if he was the only person who could have done something to save the ship and the passengers? Back in the day, ships didn't have smart advanced technology like they do today. They couldn't see a threat on the horizon. Binoculars were pretty helpful, but the crew members on the Titanic didn't have access to the room where they were kept. David Blair was the man responsible for the keys. He left the ship in a hurry and forgot to hand over the keys that were in his pocket. Maybe if the crew members had had access to the binoculars, they would have seen the iceberg on time and had enough time to change course. It's possible that the giant iceberg that sent the Titanic to the ocean bottom was made of snow that had fallen in southwest Greenland. Scientists even used a computer model to calculate the paths the iceberg took in any given year, taking into consideration ocean currents and weather readings for that year. It's possible that the iceberg was 1,700 feet long, with a weight of around 75 tons. By the time it collided with the Titanic, it had dwindled down to only 1.5 tons. Violet Constance Jessup was, as many called her, Miss Unsinkable. She was only 24 years old when she joined the Titanic crew as a stewardess. On the tragic night when the ship struck the iceberg, she was lying in bed. As soon as she heard that something was going on, she got dressed and quickly went to the deck. Violet helped passengers get into lifeboats. 4 years later, she was on the Britannic, the Titanic's sister ship. Once again, the ship started sinking. Not only did the woman survive another accident, but she was also once again the one helping other people to escape the vessel before it disappeared below the surface.
No one could ever have imagined that the unsinkable Titanic would collide with an iceberg, except for one man, William Thomas Stead. Well, not directly, of course. It's not like he jolted out of bed one day, envisioning the fall of the Titanic. Rather, he wrote an empowering short story called How the Mail Steamer Went Down in Mid-Atlantic by a Survivor on March 3, 1886, 26 years before Titanic sank. Okay, let's do a super quick recap. Titanic was traveling from Southampton to New York in April 1912 in the North Atlantic. The ship hit an iceberg, and less than 3 hours later, it was completely underwater. Out of 2,208 people on board, just 706 survived due to the limited number of lifeboats and icy cold water. Another passenger ship, Carpathia, heard the distress call, picked up the survivors, and brought them safely to New York. The short story William Stead wrote was about Thomas, a British sailor, who got on a passenger liner bound for the U.S. At one point, the protagonist realized there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board the ship in case something happened. A couple of days later, heavy fog covered everything in sight. Luck was not on the liner's side, and it collided with a stray ship, just like Titanic struck an iceberg. Only 200 out of the 916 people made it safely to the U.S. The main character managed to survive by jumping into the water and climbing into one of the lifeboats. Now, you'd think that the story riled up everyone in the industry to add extra lifeboats on ships. But sadly, it received very little attention when it was published. Even more tragically, William Thomas Stead was on Titanic when it sank, and he didn't make it. The survivors who knew Stead mentioned that he had always been cheerful and had loved to chat during meals. He complimented the ship's design and how sturdy it was. Witnesses also talked about how he had been helpful when the ship had been sinking, having given his life jacket to someone else. He was a journalist by profession and was on his way to New York for a ceremony. One of his most important contributions to modern journalism was the use of illustrations in every newspaper article. He also introduced newspaper interviews, and they're still used to this day along with illustrations. But this story wasn't the only published work that predicted the disaster. Morgan Robertson was an author and former ship captain who wrote short stories and novels. His most notable novella is The Wreck of the Titan. It's also known as Futility. The book was written in 1898, 14 years before Titanic. It was a fictional story about the Titan, an ocean liner similar to Titanic, which was crossing the North Atlantic. It's also a coincidence that Titan was just as fast as Titanic and shared many other similarities, like size and design. The book described it as unsinkable and the largest ship to hit the ocean at the time. That's what they said about Titanic, too. Another eerie similarity was the limited number of lifeboats it had. The story took place in April, and that's when Titanic set off on its journey and hit the iceberg. The Titan story also mentioned that barely anyone had survived that horrible accident. Unlike Stead's story, the protagonist of Robertson took a different path. The Titan sinking happened somewhere halfway through the book, so after the accident, the main character went on with his life. The book was brought back into the spotlight after the Titanic disaster. How could someone describe the events that took place almost a decade later so accurately? Many started to believe Robertson could see the future. But the reality was that Robertson knew his way around a ship. It was easy for him to write down the nitty-gritty of things without doing more research. Realistically, one of the biggest threats for ships at that time was hitting an iceberg or colliding with other ships. The next story sounds somewhat mysterious. Once, Alex Mackenzie heard a voice that warned him not to board Titanic. But when he turned around, there was nobody there. As he continued walking, the voice spoke to him again. But this time, it was louder and more distinct. He took the warning seriously and decided to cancel the trip and go back to Glasgow, Scotland, his hometown. His grandparents weren't too happy to find him back home instead of on Titanic. After all, the ticket was very expensive. That disappointment very soon disappeared when they heard that the ship had struck an iceberg. John Coffey was a member of the crew of Titanic, but he decided to ditch the ride when the ship stopped at his hometown in Queenstown, Ireland. His inner voice told him to get off the liner, and he did. He was only 23 at the time, and for someone his age, it could be a major career boost and an opportunity to grow. Despite the horrible tragedy, the guy signed to work with the RMS Mauritania just months after the Titanic sinking. Talk about commitment. Some added info was revealed about what may have contributed to the fall of Titanic. The constructors insisted that the ship was unsinkable, but many people later theorized that the vessel's steel plates had been too frail for the freezing Atlantic water. It may have caused the rivets to pop, allowing ocean water to seep inside. Another theory is that there may have been a fire in the hull of the Titanic that had been raging for 3 weeks before the voyage. The fire softened the steel, allowing the iceberg to cut through it like a hot knife through butter. Some pictures before the ship set off on its journey show black marks on the hull, which could have been caused by fire. Either way, the iceberg would have caused significant damage in any case, no matter if there was a fire or not. Some people also blame those who designed the Titanic. The ship was built with large joints at the bottom, which probably snapped easily during the collision. Of course, these are all theories, but we know for a fact that the iceberg was the main character of this drama, and that the works of Stead and Robertson should have been taken seriously. Either way, this should be a lesson for the future, helping to prevent similar tragic accidents. By the way, ocean liners and passenger ships wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, he invented a steam engine that was so strong it could produce enough energy to power a ship. And a century later, in 1819, the first steamship traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool, UK. It only took the vessel 29 days to cross the ocean. The passenger ship industry boomed in the early 1900s when it became easier for people to move to America or go on holidays. As decades rolled by, the use of aircraft stole the spotlight from passenger ships since planes were faster and more efficient. Nowadays, it's quite rare for a passenger ship to collide with anything in open water. Modern technologies can detect anything that can pose a threat and even predict stormy weather. Cruise ships these days are giants compared to the vessels of Titanic's era. Modern ships can carry almost twice the number of passengers and have amenities folks back then could only dream of. Most cruise ships these days have several restaurants to choose from, multiple swimming pools, and game rooms to catch a break. If you're in the mood for some fun, you can watch live performances. Don't forget about the helicopter pad, because why not? Don't worry if you start feeling unwell. The in-house doctors are always there to help any passenger in need. And these ships are only going to get bigger. Putting Titanic and a modern cruise ship side by side is like comparing a Corgi to a Doberman. Back then, Titanic was the biggest and most cutting-edge vessel anyone could dream of. So, who knows what the future of cruise ships can hold? We might even have entire cities floating around. That would be a really big boat.
They were on their way to the New World when a rendezvous with an iceberg crushed all of their dreams and hopes. There was panic and tears and heartbreaking goodbyes, like that of Jack and Rose. Or was there? Let's see how well you know the real story of Titanic. The love story of Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater was inspired by true events. What do you say? Is it a myth or a fact? The most emotional Titanic love story was actually all made up by the screenwriter and director of the famous movie, James Cameron. Some passengers featured in the movie were real though, and by a mere coincidence, there was a J. Dawson on board. His name was Joseph, not Jack, and he worked as a coal trimmer. The most expensive object lost with the Titanic was a painting by Pablo Picasso. What's your take on this one? It's a myth. Another one given to us by the famous movie. The most valuable item that went down with the Titanic was probably a Mary Joseph Blondell painting, created in 1814. Some other valuable items were a violin that belonged to Wallace Hartley, the musician who insisted that they had to play till the very last moment. There was also a 1912 Renault Type CB Coupe de Ville that would now cost millions of dollars, a handwritten manuscript by Joseph Conrad, first edition essays by Francis Bacon, 5 Steinway grand pianos, and, of course, some fine china plates and cups and first-class passengers' jewelry. The Titanic was the largest and the most luxurious passenger ship of its time. Does it sound real to you? Yep, it's totally true. In April 1912, the Titanic was the largest ship ever built. It was 882 feet long and had a maximum passenger capacity of 2,435 people. That's not a lot compared to the largest cruise ship of today, the Symphony of the Seas. It's just a bit longer than the Titanic, but has more than double the passenger numbers. And yes, no other cruise liner has probably beaten the Titanic in terms of luxury to this day. It costs more than $200 million to build in today's money. The tickets were also quite expensive. Duh! First-class tickets ranged in price from $1,700 in today's money for a berth up to $50,000 for one of the 2 parlor suites. Second-class tickets were $700. Third-class passengers had to pay between $170 to $460. Most of the passengers of the unsinkable ship managed to survive. True or false? Sadly, it's false. Only 37% of all the passengers actually survived the meeting with the Titanic. Around 61% of the first-class passengers, 42% of the second-class passengers, and 24% of the third-class passengers made it out alive. The Titanic was passing through the Bermuda Triangle when things went wrong, and that's probably why it sunk. What do you say, myth or reality? It's 100% a myth. The Titanic never even came close to the Bermuda Triangle. The liner sank about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, which is a huge distance to the north of Bermuda, the infamous area where ships and planes disappear without a trace. We might have the moon to blame for the sinking of the Titanic. True or false? This one is true. The moon heavily affects the tides on Earth. The closer the moon is to the Earth, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of our satellite. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide, the alignment of the moon, the sun, and the Earth that makes their combined gravity reach its peak twice a month. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. Icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers drift off to the coastal waters of Labrador and Newfoundland, where they often run aground. To move on, they need to either melt and become lighter, or catch a high tide that would carry them further. The 1912's tide was as high as it gets. So they shifted many shipping routes south because of the huge amount of icebergs. But not the Titanic, of course, as they believed it was unsinkable. It took 4 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to sink. What do you say? It's false, and if you're a Titanic expert, you definitely know it was actually 2 hours and 40 minutes. And this was slow enough, given the damage caused by the iceberg. It didn't sink faster, thanks to the ship's construction. There were 16 watertight compartments in the lower part of the ship. They worked as a lifeline. When the iceberg crashed into the hull, it broke into 6 boxes. The Titanic could have stayed afloat only if 4 compartments had been damaged. Water filled the first 6 compartments within 1 hour. During this time, the ship tilted slightly to the right side. Then, water began to flood the 7th box when all 6 boxes were filled. And from that moment, the sinking rate was growing with every second. The ship's bow sank under the water, and then the stern filled up. One of the leading reasons for the Titanic tragedy was signal rockets. True or false? What's your take on it? This one is true. When any ship sinks, the crew members must release red flares. It's a signal to all nearby ships that someone is in trouble. But for an unknown reason, someone put white lights in the Titanic's rocket box. When the ship crashed into an iceberg, the crew members released white flares. Another ship, SS Californian, was nearby at the time. Its captain knew the Titanic was going through a dangerous iceberg area. The crew of this ship didn't see the Titanic in the dark, but they noticed white rockets. Radio communication between the vessels didn't work. The SS Californian operator turned off the receiver. The Californian captain felt that something was wrong, so he sent a Morse lamp signal to the Titanic. But it was too late. The ship was already underwater, so no one could respond. Another ship, Samson, was sailing alongside the Titanic. It drifted with lights off since it was catching seals, and that's not legal. When the captain saw the Titanic's white rockets, he thought it was the Coast Guard. So Samson sailed away as fast as they could. They realized they had abandoned the drowning passengers once they made it to Iceland and learned the horrible news. In 1996, one expedition managed to raise the Titanic from the ocean floor. Do you believe it? If you don't, you're right. There were different ideas on how to raise the Titanic, from doing it with compressed air to putting it in wire mesh and covering it with liquid nitrogen, or using giant magnets. The only real attempt to raise the Titanic was made in 1996, and it failed dramatically. The expedition's goal was to lift a part of its hull, weighing about 21 tons. It would still have been the largest piece to see the sunlight again, if the operation had succeeded, that is. They lowered 4 large bags filled with diesel fuel to the bottom of the ocean and attached them to the hull plate. Then, the fuel bags were released and they started lifting the pieces on their own. The plate was about 200 feet below the surface when the weather got rough. The expedition members decided to tow the part to calmer waters around 80 miles away. Long before they reached the towing destination, half of the plate broke off and sank to the bottom again. 2 of the lifting bags seemed to have broken loose, and the hull went down. The Titanic will most likely crumble to dust halfway up if someone tries lifting it again. So, how many correct answers do you have? Let me know in the comments below.
A beam of electric light pierces the darkness over the calm waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic is quietly making its way through the waves, its passengers asleep, when suddenly a monstrous white shape is caught in the light beam. The fateful iceberg is about to rend the side of the legendary ship. April 14, 1912, only 2 days before someone will take a photo of a giant iceberg with a pretty unusual elliptical shape. It turns out that this iceberg most likely formed out of snow that fell 100,000 years ago. Researchers used computer modeling to figure out its origin. They used data from 1912 and added some new information about winds and ocean currents. They concluded that the iceberg was probably a part of a small cluster of glaciers in southwest Greenland. These days, it's possible to calculate the routes of such icebergs in any given year in the past. So the infamous chunk of ice was on its way from Greenland to an area further south from Cornwall. If the ship had passed through that region only 2 days later, the iceberg would have moved far away from the point where they met. At first, the weight of the most well-known iceberg in the world was 75 million tons. With time, it started to slowly melt away, and when it sank the Titanic, its weight was only 1.5 million tons. By the time of the collision, it had probably been melting for months, but it was still a true monster. When the Titanic sank, the iceberg was 400 feet long, and more than 100 feet of its surface was above the water. Some people believe it was a supermoon that caused the Titanic to sink. That night, there was a rare lunar event. It hadn't happened for 1,400 years. In normal conditions, the iceberg wouldn't have traveled so far south without melting and losing the largest part of its mass. But the supermoon could have been the reason for an unusually high tide that pulled the iceberg away from the glacier way faster than usual. There's a specific type of bacteria that slowly consumes the remains of the Titanic. Salt corrosion, ocean currents, freezing temperatures, plus this rust-eating microorganism might consume the entire wreckage. American actress Dorothy Gibson was aboard the Titanic. She survived, and when she arrived in New York, she started filming a movie called Saved from the Titanic almost right away. The movie was released only a month after the Titanic sank, and in the movie, she even wore the same shoes and clothes she had during the actual disaster. The movie was a big success at that time, but the only known copy was destroyed in a fire. 14 years before the Titanic sank, a novella called Futility had been published, and it seemed to have predicted the whole event. The plot centered around a fictional ship called the Titan that sank during its voyage. The Titan was almost the same size as Titanic, and they both went to the bottom in April. The reason was hitting an iceberg, too. Both the real and fictional ships were described as unsinkable, and both of them had the legally required number of lifeboats, which, as it turned out later, were nowhere near enough. We've seen it in the movie, but there were some real-life love stories happening on the Titanic, too. 13 couples even took a trip on the Titanic as part of their honeymoon. One of the couples owned Macy's department store in New York. Once it became clear the Titanic was rapidly sinking, the woman refused to go into a lifeboat without her husband. But he didn't want to join her while there were still women and children who he thought had to go first. Then his wife gave her coat to her maid. She insisted that the maid should get into the lifeboat, and she wanted her to be warm. As for the woman herself, she decided to stay with her husband till the end. Some people believe Titanic sank because of a mummy, not an iceberg. It all started around 1000 BCE with a mysterious woman who lived in Egypt, in the City of Thieves. People knew little about her, but they called her a priestess. Her mummy was put in a wooden sarcophagus and covered with a large lid with the image of her face and some mystical inscriptions. This place had been hidden until the first half of the 19th century, when a group of locals accidentally came across it. They disturbed her peace. No one knows how, but the mummy disappeared that day without a trace. A couple of decades later, a group of rich friends from England traveled to Egypt and found the empty mummy casket with the image of the priestess, whose dark eyes seemed to be looking into the void. They decided to buy it, but the buyer disappeared the same night before he even got the case. All members of the group had some accidents. The casket changed its location a couple of times until it, as some believe, ended up on the Titanic. It took more than 70 years for a robot submarine to find the ruins of this legendary ship. The wreck lies nearly 13,000 feet under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, split into two halves. Why did the liner break apart? No one knows exactly. Some think it happened because of the water that got inside when the ship collided with the iceberg. The pressure was so powerful it separated two parts of the vessel, starting with the ship's bottom structure. Others say it was because of the hull rivets. They had a high concentration of slag or smelting residue, and that's something that can cause the metal to split apart. The ship generally had many flaws, starting with the design. The watertight bulkheads weren't completely sealed on top. This allowed the water to flow between the compartments and, in the end, sink the vessel. The iron of the ship's rivets and steel of the hull ended up ruined because of high sulfur content, cold temperatures, and high speeds. The steel shattered and the rivets popped out quite easily. Because of this, Titanic sank 24 times faster than it would have otherwise. If the ship had hit the iceberg head-on instead of ramming it with its side, it would have probably stayed afloat. How come the crew members didn't have binoculars? It would have surely helped them spot the iceberg on time and maybe even avoid the disaster. But the binoculars on the Titanic were locked in a storage cabinet. Only one crew member had the key, and he had been transferred off the ship right before it set sail. He later said he hadn't remembered to hand over the key. But even without the binoculars, the ship might have had some time to change course and avoid the collision if the crew had gotten some warning. But that's the thing, someone did warn them. About an hour before the incident, a ship that was relatively close to Titanic, the SS Californian, sent a message to inform them it had stopped because of dense ice field. But the warning never got to the Titanic's captain. Some experts say it was because the radio operator didn't think it was that urgent. And later, the SS Californian said they didn't get a call for help from the Titanic because their radio operator was off duty. Some say the crew on the Titanic couldn't spot the iceberg on time because of an optical illusion. Atmospheric conditions that night probably caused super refraction, which could have camouflaged the berg. After all, no one actually saw the iceberg until it was too close to the ship to somehow avoid the crash. Not even a whole minute passed between the moment they saw the iceberg and the collision. It was only 37 seconds, and it took Titanic 2 hours and 40 minutes to disappear below the ocean's waves.
The year was 1854, and the SS Arctic, the fastest passenger liner of its time, set out to cross the Atlantic. As it sailed through the misty veil, it slowly disappeared into the unknown. The Collins Line, an American shipping company, was started in 1818 and only began seriously trading in the transatlantic by 1835. Its steamships crossed the Atlantic from Liverpool to New York within just 10 days. Doesn't sound like a great speed today, I know, but back then, the same thing took other ships several weeks. Light on the water with their wooden hulls, powering through with a strong steam engine, those steamships were the favorite choice for many high-profile people. What could go wrong with such an advanced ship, they thought. This reminds me of some other ship everyone believed to be unsinkable. But anyway, back to the Collins Line. It grew to be a serious contender on transatlantic routes, with only one other competitor, the Cunard's Line. It was a British company also aiming to be the main force through the Arctic Passage. In 1835, the company received a new ship that traveled to Liverpool and came back to New York with the largest cargo ever at that time. From then, the Collins Line was steadily growing. It seemed like there would only be future successes for it. Unfortunately, their lavish ships became costly to run with the amount of coal used. Massive power along with weak wooden hulls meant they needed many repairs after each voyage. So, every trip ended up being expensive. But since the ships were safe and had a great reputation, people were willing to pay the price, and the company was definitely not in crisis. They had achieved something no one had managed to do before them. Like I told you, their ships crossed the Atlantic in a whopping 10 days, and Edward Collins, the owner, was very determined to maintain the pace. Their 5 ships easily outran the Cunard's Line of only 3. With this great praise, it provided more attention. Though the Cunard's ships were slower with their iron hulls, they believed there was still profit, regardless of how slowly they sailed. Among Collins' ships, the Arctic, the third of them to be launched, was the largest, reaching 284 feet long, with 2 side-lever steam engines, each with 1,000 horsepower. The paddle wheels made 16 revolutions a minute when at full speed. At the time of its launch, the press called it the most stupendous vessel ever constructed in the United States. But glamour and fame couldn't avoid what would come next. On the 27th of September, the Arctic was on its journey from Liverpool to New York, continuing a speed pace through the thick fog. It's possible that by that moment, after 4 years of record-breaking trips, the crew became overconfident with their sailing and the ship. Going only 50 miles from Newfoundland, they carelessly continued through the fog with no radio contact, sonar, or any other form of identifying objects, equipped only with Morse code. A smaller ship, the SS Vesta, which operated as a fishing vessel, often worked around Newfoundland. It was passing through the same path as the Arctic and crashed into its side. Shocked by the collision, the captain of the Arctic offered help to the much smaller Vesta, but it was soon clear that the damage that seemed minor on the Arctic was far worse. Beneath the waterline, a hole was letting water into the hull. The cost of the much faster wooden hull now seemed less valuable. They steered toward land, trying to plug the holes, but they weren't doing so well, and the seawater continued to pour in, filling up higher and pushing the ship down. And finally, once the engine room was full, it put out the boilers, taking away the massive power the Arctic was once legendary for. They moved slowly until coming to a complete stop. The ship continued to sink, and the order was to abandon it. At the time, maritime law allowed for the Arctic to carry only 6 lifeboats, only capable of saving 180 people. The crew and some of the passengers managed to push their way aboard and took most of the seats on those boats. Things were pretty wild, and everyone forgot about their manners, not letting the ladies and the youngest ones board first. It took 4 hours for the Arctic to sink. 150 crew and 250 passengers were on board. Those that weren't able to find a lifeboat made a desperate attempt to build their own rafts from parts of the ship. 2 days later, only 3 boats made it safely to the shore. The other 3 were never found. Believe it or not, the rescue party also saved some people that had been clinging to the wreckage for 2 days. Unlike the crew, the captain went down with the Arctic, but amazingly survived. He would be only one of 85 people that made it, out of the 400 on board. When the news arrived 2 weeks later, the public responded with great sadness to the losses. Great anger soon followed towards the poor safety measures in the crew. The press published demands to change the laws for more lifeboats. It only made sense to have enough for every person on board a ship. But they ignored those requests. This neglect would lead to more disasters in the future. Enough lifeboats would only come into maritime law some 60 years later, after the disaster of the Titanic. Edward Collins' wife and 2 children were also aboard the ship and didn't return. He was heartbroken, but didn't stop running his business. The Collins line still had a reputation to uphold, the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious on the Atlantic. Edward Collins would now build an even better ship than any other. It was named the Adriatic, and it was the largest ship in the world, 354 feet long. With 2 alternating steam engines that had never been built of this size. These steam engines at the time were at the height of engineering, though today you can only see them in models and toys. With the new addition of 2 masts, the Adriatic would also be able to sail if needed. Luckily, they made some lessons from the disaster of the Arctic. But before their new ship, the Adriatic, was built, another disaster had occurred. The sister ship of the Arctic had also sunk. They believed this second ship was desperate to stay in front of the Cunard's line and hit an iceberg somewhere during the race. This weird contest took the lives of 141 people. The desperation of Collins and his weakly built hulls pushed the company towards bankruptcy in 1858. The newly built Adriatic costing over $1 million, had only made one voyage in the end. And even that voyage was considered a disaster. The ship collided with a tugboat. It still managed to finish its maiden voyage at a suitable time. After the company had gone bankrupt, they had to sell the ship for only $50,000. They removed the great giant engines, replacing them with only sails. Although it was once the greatest ship on the high seas, it was only 30 years later until it was abandoned, labeled irreparable, and anchored in a river. The other remaining ships were also sold and only used for parts. Edward Collins left the industry altogether, seeking work on dry land instead. As the Collins line was no longer in the mix, the Cunards would grow in strength. Without competition, they would win the Blue Riband for the next 30 years, and 180 years later, after producing hundreds of ships. They still have a constant presence on the seas as they provide transatlantic crossings, world voyages, and leisure cruises. To this day, the Cunard line is the only one to run ships between Europe and America, and it's great proof that it's not always the fastest that's the best.
We've all heard of the famous story of the sinking of the Titanic. But if you really think about it, it's not just one story, but so many stories all at once. It is a story of strength and courage, as with the likes of Margaret Brown stepping in to help passengers in need. It is a story of luck and guile, like with Arthur John Priest, a man who not only survived the Titanic, but also 3 other tragedies at sea. It is a story of perseverance and intrigue, as with Violet Jessup, a stewardess who had also survived 3 shipwrecks and then continued to serve for 30 more years after that. These are the stories of their personal journeys. When the RMS Titanic set sail from England on April 10, 1912, it was the largest ship ever built at its time. It was 883 feet long and 175 feet tall, and it took 3,000 workers 26 months to build it. Considered to be the pinnacle of nautical engineering, this ship was touted by its makers to be unsinkable. Of course, 4 days after its maiden voyage at sea, that claim would be proven false. On April 14th, the Titanic hit the iceberg. The collision ruptured the hull, and the 16 supposedly watertight compartments designed to keep the ship afloat quickly flooded with water. It took the liner 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. And of the 2,240 passengers and crew on board, only 706 survived. One of those survivors was Margaret Brown. She was a philanthropist and actress who had traveled to Europe to visit her daughter in Paris. However, when Brown got word that a grandchild had fallen ill back in America, she bought a ticket for the next available ocean liner that would take her home, which just so happened to be the Titanic. As a wealthy woman, whose husband had become rich after finding gold in one of the mines that he owned, Brown was able to get first-class accommodations on the vessel. For over 4 days, she enjoyed many of the luxuries that came with her ticket. There were the expected services, like a large dining room with a live orchestra. But the vessel also was equipped with a gym, squash courts, and a swimming pool. And she'd spend her time in the first-class lounge that had been designed in the architectural style of the Palace of Versailles. When the Titanic started to sink, Brown could have jumped into the first available lifeboat and made her way to safety, but she did not. Instead, she joined the relief efforts and helped others get out, putting her own life at risk. In fact, by some accounts, a crew member had to physically pick her up and drop her into a lifeboat, number 6, in order to get her off the ship. With all the confusion and fear around, Brown went on to take control of the lifeboat. She even got the women on board to help paddle, knowing that it would help them keep warm in the cold night's air. There were also reports that she had an argument with the crewman who was in charge of that particular boat. When she suggested that they paddle toward the ship to help save others, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens refused, claiming that when the massive Titanic would finally go under, their tiny lifeboat would be pulled down with it if they were too close. An hour and 20 minutes after the Titanic sank, the survivors were finally rescued by the RMS Carpathia. Even then, Brown was still hard at work, now ensuring that passengers from the second and third classes were provided with basic necessities such as food and blankets. Initially dubbed the heroine of the Titanic, she would later be nicknamed the unsinkable Molly Brown. A bit of an odd nickname, considering that she was never called Molly in her normal life. However, her story was so compelling that it was eventually turned into a musical in 1960, and into a movie in 1964. And her character would continue to pop up in several other films about the tragedy. There was also another person on board, who was also later declared unsinkable, though his series of events that led to him earning this title are far more tragic. His real name was Arthur John Priest. He worked as a stoker and fireman. This meant that he spent most of his time below deck, helping shovel coal into the furnaces that created the steam needed to keep the ship moving. It was a dirty, sweaty job, but it was also a big responsibility, as stokers had to ensure the furnaces did not overheat or set fire to the whole ship. Priest was one of the 163 stokers hired to work on the Titanic for his first big trip. He helped shovel the 600 tons of coal the engines needed each day. When the ship hit the iceberg, Priest was relaxing in the bunker he shared with his co-workers, not far from his workstation. Escape was difficult, and his chances of survival were low. He had to move fast, running through corridors and along gangplanks, as he made a desperate dash onto the deck. And once there, he had only one option left: to jump into the frigid Atlantic Ocean. Imagine the shock of being enveloped by 27-degree water, surrounded by panicked screams in the darkness of the night. Despite all this, Priest swam, and remarkably, with frostbite setting in, he found safety on a lifeboat. He was one of only 44 stokers to survive. As if that wasn't enough, Priest would go on to survive 3 other sinking ship disasters, including the HMS Alcantara in 1916, the Titanic's sister ship the Britannic, also in 1916, and then the Donegal in 1917. It was for this miraculous record that he was later known as the unsinkable stoker. After the Donegal, Priest finally retired from working on ships, although he claimed he only did so because nobody would agree to sail with him. Now, people who had been in a shipwreck often remain afraid of water for the rest of their lives. But let me tell you a story of a woman who survived not 1, not 2, but 3 ship disasters, and then continued to work on cruise liners as a stewardess. Meet Violet Jessup, Miss Unsinkable. Her childhood can be described in one word: short. Violet had to grow up very quickly to take care of her siblings. She was the oldest of 9 children. Life became even more difficult when she became very ill. The doctors were sure that she wouldn't survive, but she did. Shortly after recovering, she moved to England with her mother, took care of her sisters, and attended a convent school. Her mother worked as a stewardess at sea, and when she fell sick, young Violet followed in her footsteps. But because of her youth and beauty, no one wanted to hire her, thinking that she would distract passengers and crew. But Violet didn't give up, and instead came to one of the interviews in her worst clothes and with unkempt hair. She wanted to show that she was ready for hard work on the ship. She was hired on the spot. The first 2 years passed uneventfully, but then a series of incredible fortunes began, or misfortunes depending on how you look at it. In 1910, Miss Jessup got a job on the most luxurious liner of its time, the Royal Mail ship Olympic. This ship sailed across the Atlantic from England to America. The engineers didn't focus on the speed of this vessel, but on its comfort. While working on that ship, Jessup was paid just £2 a month, the same as £200 today. Hard work on the ship's deck from morning to night didn't frighten Jessup. She loved the job. She liked to talk to the people and enjoyed the beautiful views of the Atlantic. So, on September 20th, 1911, Jessup was working on the deck as usual. The sea was calm and the weather was excellent. The ship was sailing through the Solent Strait, which separates the Isle of Wight from the British mainland. At this moment, the British military cruiser Hawke appeared ahead. It should have simply passed by the Olympic, but something went wrong. For whatever reason, the ships started going straight at each other. The Olympic's captain tried to maneuver to avoid a collision, but failed. The Hawk's bow was designed specifically to ram other ships, so when it rammed the Olympic, it made an impact. The liner shuddered, and the people screamed in fear and panic. The ship had a huge hole in the starboard. Jessup fell from the force of the blow. It seemed that one of the biggest liners of its time was going to sink. But luckily, both ships stayed afloat, and nobody got hurt. You would think that an accident like this would frighten Jessup, but nope. She didn't give it a second thought, and it continued to work as a stewardess. In April of 1912, she decided to take a job on the best, most unsinkable ship of the time, where she was supposed to serve VIPs. Initially, she didn't want to work on this ship, only agreeing to it after much persuasion from her friends. And that's how Violet Jessup boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1912. 4 days later, when the infamous iceberg collided with the ship, Jessup was resting in her cabin. She was almost asleep when she felt the jolt. Immediately, she was called to the upper deck. Surprisingly, when the Titanic first hit the iceberg, almost nobody panicked. No one could believe that the unsinkable ship could actually sink. As the ship's hold was being filled with water, everybody was just calmly carrying on about their business on the upper decks. It was only when the cabin crew started instructing passengers to reach their lifeboats that panic finally set in. Jessup, along with other stewards, was actively aiding the passengers' evacuation to the lifeboats. The rule was that women and children were to be evacuated first. But when many of the women hesitated to step onto the lifeboats, delaying the crew's efforts, one of the ship's officers ordered Jessup to get into a boat to show the other women it was perfectly safe. Soon, others followed, and then someone suddenly thrust a swaddled baby into her hands. Without a second thought, Jessup hugged the child to her chest to keep it warm while the Titanic was sinking. She didn't let go of the baby until her lifeboat was picked up by the Carpathia, the ship that came to the rescue. As Jessup boarded the ship with the baby, a woman ran up to her and, without saying a word, snatched the child from Jessup's hands. I mean, she assumed the woman was the baby's mother, so she didn't try to get it back. She was too numb and frozen to think how strange it was this woman hadn't even said thank you for saving her baby. Many years later, Jessup would be reminded of this baby under some mysterious circumstances. After successfully surviving one of the most terrible shipwrecks in history, Jessup, of course, continued to work at sea. In 1916, she took a job as a nurse on the hospital ship Britannic, which you might remember is the sister ship to both the Olympic and the Titanic. Except this one sailed in the Aegean Sea. On November 21st, the ship was traveling down its very familiar route, but on that particular day, luck was not on its side. This would become the third shipwreck Jessup will have survived. However, this rescue wasn't as easy as the previous two. After the accident, the huge Britannic began to sink quickly. It took less than an hour for the ship to completely sink. Jessup didn't have time to board a lifeboat this time, so she jumped into the cold water. There, she swam to the closest lifeboat and got on. But then everyone on the boat noticed that the ship's propellers were still working. They were spinning in the water, creating a whirlpool that was pulling the boat toward them. Jessup jumped off the boat just in time to escape the propellers, but her ordeal was far from over. While in the water, she was pulled down to the ship's keel and hit her head. The only thing that saved her from losing consciousness, and probably her life, was her thick hair slightly cushioning the impact. And so, somehow, against all odds, Jessup got away from the engine and was soon picked up by another boat. For the next few years after this accident, Jessup was plagued by headaches. When she finally went to the doctor, he told her she was incredibly lucky to still be alive. The incident on the Britannic resulted in a fracture in her skull. You would think that 3 shipwrecks and a fractured skull would be enough to stop anyone. But not Violet Jessup. She continued to work on cruise ships until the year 1950. She even cruised on the world twice on the luxury liner Belgenland. Fortunately, the rest of Miss Jessup's career went without any further mishaps. In 1950, she moved to Great Ashfield in Suffolk County, having worked at sea for almost 42 years. Content with her career, she settled in a large cottage built in the 16th century. But a year into her retirement, she received a strange phone call. It was late at night, and Jessup was asleep when the phone rang. She picked up the phone and heard a woman's voice on the other end. The lady didn't introduce herself and asked right away, "Excuse me, was it you who saved a baby on the Titanic?" Jessup answered, "Yes, it was me." She laughed and hung up. Jessup later told her friend about this strange call. She assumed that some kids were playing a joke on her, but Jessup had never told anyone about the baby before that call. And according to the old records, the only child who was on the boat with Jessup was a boy. But those same records also said that the boy had been saved by another passenger. To this day, it's still unknown who the baby that Jessup rescued was. Either way, for surviving 3 different wrecks on 3 different ships, she was aptly dubbed Miss Unsinkable. And there you have it, 3 incredible stories of 3 remarkable individuals. And there's many more like them. Stories like these prove there's a hero in all of us that can come out in unexpected circumstances. But of course, I hope you'll never need to put that theory to the test. See you next time, and safe travels.
Staying in the water that's 70 degrees Fahrenheit for a long time definitely won't do your health any good. A water temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit is a nightmare. It feels much colder than the air of the same temperature. The passengers of the Titanic were in 28 degrees Fahrenheit water. Can you imagine how cold it was? Even the iceberg that the Titanic met was warmer. The water didn't freeze because of the high salt content. But what if the temperature had been higher? What if the Titanic had sunk in warm water, say 120 degrees Fahrenheit? Theoretically, this could have happened had the waters of the North Atlantic met a warm undercurrent from the southern part of the ocean on disaster day. But this heat wouldn't have been enough. The ocean area is too vast, and the temperature is too low at night. The warm undercurrent alone wouldn't have made a difference for people who were overboard. But if the Titanic had sunk in another place at one particular moment, perhaps then all people could have been saved, thanks to an incredible natural phenomenon. Now, on board everybody, our voyage to a parallel universe begins. It's a moonless night on April 14th through 15th. The Titanic crashes into an iceberg. Icy water floods the lower decks. The captain sends a distress signal. The nearest rescue ship, Carpathia, is 58 miles away from the sinking Titanic. At maximum speed, Carpathia will get there in 4 hours. That's quite long, even in warm tropical waters, since your body loses heat anyway. The Titanic begins to sink. The crew downs lifeboats. Some of the passengers jump overboard. The ship is going under the water. There are no boats left, so you jump along with other passengers. It feels as if you got inside a huge iceberg. The water is so cold that it's hard for you to move. You can't even scream because there's no air in your lungs. But at this moment, you feel a pleasant warmth coming from the depths. The heat rises above your knees and waist, then reaches your neck. Finally, you regain control of your muscles and can breathe deeply. You notice that all the other passengers feel the same warmth. The water becomes a little hot. It makes you happy. But in a moment, horror replaces your delight. The ocean begins to foam. And not because of the high temperature, but because something is rising from the ocean floor. You hear a heavy, low sound coming from the depths. It's not a sinking Titanic, but something bigger. You can see a huge iceberg nearby. It's melting, and a huge chunk is breaking off from it. 1 million bubbles appear on the surface. Then you feel something hit you in the leg. Thousands of strange lightweight rocks are rising from below. There are also massive plates among them. People use them as lifeboats. You climb on one of those rocks and look at the ship. It doesn't sink, since all the water is bubbling and pushing the vessel up. You take one of the small rocks and understand everything. It's pumice. An underwater volcano has woken up right under the ship. Thousands of tons of volcanic rock are floating to the surface. When it erupts, its magma shakes the entire space, heats the water, and destroys the seabed. but it doesn't result in anything destructive on the surface. The enormous pressure of hundreds of millions of gallons of water suppresses the volcano's power. Molten rocks of the Earth's crust are pressed against the seabed, and pumice rises to the surface. And here's why it happens. The upper part of Earth consists of many solid parts, tectonic plates. These plates collide with each other and divide. And when one part separates from another, the magma immediately comes up. So, all volcanoes are these unstable fault sites. If the Titanic had sailed over one of these areas during an eruption, many passengers would have been saved. Back in the parallel universe, you notice the Titanic starts sinking again. The water is no longer bubbling. The volcano has gone out. In a matter of seconds, the ocean turns icy again. Fortunately, you have your pumice lifeboat. This is enough to wait for rescuers. But let's imagine a situation with no underwater volcano and an iceberg. A situation when the water was warm from the very beginning. One of the engines in the motor compartment of the ship breaks down. Several pipes burst because of increased pressure, and now there's a crack in the ship's body. Water is filling the lower decks. The ship is sinking. People evacuate on lifeboats. There's less panic since the night is warm and no one is freezing. Each passenger gets a life jacket. The ship is breaking. You understand that you have to jump. The Titanic goes underwater. Many passengers fall overboard in horror. They dive into the dark ocean and immediately come to the surface. Panic and complete chaos take over. The ship disappears in the dark, and finally, it's all silent. A few minutes pass, and you notice there's no panic at all. The water is warm. Almost all passengers have life jackets. Someone is floating on the wooden ship wreckage. After a couple of hours, the water no longer seems so comfortable. The ocean takes away your body heat. To keep warm, passengers swim closer to each other in a tight circle. Yeah, now it's quite possible to wait for another couple of hours till the rescuers come. People on lifeboats sail closer and take those who freeze on board. Passengers take turns, 20 minutes in the water, then 20 minutes in boats. It's essential not to take your clothes off. Even a wet outfit helps keep your body warm for longer. And when it seems that everyone is saved, somebody screams. A girl in a boat looks scared. She trembles with fear and points her finger into the black water. Passengers try to see what's there and notice a triangular fin. 1, 2, 3. There are so many of them! The noise of the sinking ship has attracted a group of sharks, and now they are circling the survivors, hoping to satisfy their hunger. They're swimming slowly. It doesn't look like they're going to attack. But you should keep your eyes open, as these fish are some of the world's most aggressive and dangerous sharks, the bull sharks. They can be agile, fast, and unpredictable. They don't swim in the cold waters of the Atlantic, but the water in this parallel universe is perfect for them. The sharks are strong and sturdy. They create the illusion of slowness to relax their prey. They're called bull sharks because of their short, blunt muzzle, like that of a bull, and they like to hit a target or other sharks with their forehead. Several fish are ramming boats. Someone falls into the water. Fortunately, people help them back on board. The sharks aren't going to retreat. Chaos and panic ensue. People are screaming and splashing the water with paddles to scare away the fish, but it doesn't help. One of the sharks opens its toothy mouth and clings to a boat. At this moment, you notice more fins nearby. A pack of great white sharks arrives at the party. They are some of the most dangerous animals on the planet. They're big, fast, and strong, and their 300 triangular teeth lined in several rows are sharp as blades. Great white sharks swim around the boats and scare away the bull sharks. You fall off the boat and see a big fin approaching you. Fear awakens the survival instinct in you. You're trying your best to swim away from the shark as far as possible. Of course, it's useless, since the shark is much faster and will definitely catch you. You feel your foot touching the shark's nose. The other foot gets into the toothy mouth. You scream in horror. After a second, the shark lets you go. Great white sharks rarely attack people. If they bite, it's just to test you. After all, the shark's favorite prey is seals. It simply loses interest if it realizes you aren't a seal. But if the shark is starving, it doesn't matter to it what kind of prey you are. Lucky for you, this one is not like that. Those survivors in the boats have almost nothing to fear either. Great white sharks don't attack them. They can push boats slightly, but only to test them. The great white shark is swimming away from you. But a bull one appears, and it looks like it's hungry. The shark is swimming towards you, opens its mouth, and a loud ship horn penetrates the water. This is the RMS Carpathia that has come to the rescue. All the sharks swim away scared. All passengers are saved. Back in our universe, another ship that had been nearby could have saved the passengers much earlier. But that's another story.
It was September 12, 1990. In those times, way before instant messaging and Zoom calls, a little girl was looking for pen pals. Zoe was aboard a ship from England to Belgium on vacation with her parents. She was only 10 years old at the time, but was a very clever schoolgirl. She took a piece of paper and started putting some words together. She introduced herself, then wrote about how she liked ballet and playing the flute and the piano. Of course, she couldn't help but mention her two adored pets, a little hamster she called Sparkle and her fish Speckle. She also put down the address at which she could be reached in case someone was interested in writing back to her. But alas, she was at sea. Who could she send this message to? An interesting idea came to her mind. She carefully placed her letter in a plastic bottle, tightly closed the lid to protect it from the water, and threw it into the sea. The little girl's excitement faded away over the years as she didn't receive a response. Maybe the bottle got stuck somewhere. Maybe it was swallowed by some big, scary sea creature. Or maybe the water actually poked through the plastic cap and destroyed her message. Many years later, on Christmas, a letter for Zoe was received at her parents' house under her maiden name. The postage signaled that the message was from Europe. It was from a Dutch couple, Piet and Jacqueline Leteau, who had found her delicate bottle and were very considerate to write back. They pointed out that they had found the letter among the debris thrown at the shore by the sea. Zoe's letter had been stranded for a staggering 23 years at sea and traveled for more than 350 miles to reach its final destination near Rotterdam in the Netherlands. That's quite a voyage for a small plastic bottle. A story similar to that of Zoe is the strange connection between two little boys. A little German boy named Frank Uzbek was on a boat traveling to Denmark when he got the same idea as Zoe. He was 5 years old at the time he put together a message and threw it into the unknown. The year was 1987. He got his response years later when he was 29. His letter, just like the one Zoe would send a couple of years later, had been at sea for 24 years. His message was found by a boy named Daniel Korotkin while he was on a walk with his parents on the Koronian Spit near the Baltic Sea. Daniel was lucky that his father knew enough German to translate the message. The unlikely friends eventually met via video call in 2011. Not all message-in-a-bottle stories have been explained away. In 2013, a Croatian surfer came across a damaged bottle while near the Adriatic Sea. The message it contained dated back to 1985, and it was from a man named Jonathan. The sender was eager for his letter to reach a woman named Mary, and he also expressed his keenness for her to respond. Since the letter was supposedly sent from Nova Scotia, the bottle had to have traveled a mind-boggling 3,700 miles. The message went from the Atlantic Ocean, entered the Mediterranean Sea, and reached the Adriatic shores in Croatia. The identities of neither John nor Mary were ever discovered. There are also messages in a bottle with wonderful love stories to share. This was the case for Ake and Paulina Viking. When Ake, a lonely Swedish sailor, placed a letter in a bottle and threw it in the Mediterranean Sea, he had no idea the piece of paper would eventually reach his future wife. This was in the early 1950s. The bottle was found by an Italian man who was inspired enough to give it to his niece, Paulina. After a year of back-and-forth letters being exchanged, Ake and Paulina eventually met and got married. Having decided to share their story with the world, they became somewhat of a celebrity couple for the time. They even shared video footage of their wedding with the world, and their story was featured in a bunch of newspapers. This fortunate event started a movement between young people looking for love. increasing the number of messages being thrown out at sea in search of a fairy tale ending. Not all the stories that started out like this eventually worked out, though. In 1945, an American named Frank Hayostak placed a similar message to that of Akis in a bottle and threw it in the waters. Almost a year later, his letter was found by an Irish woman. Her name was Brenda O'Sullivan. Their years of correspondence soon caught the attention of the media at the time, but their friendship never flourished because of the added pressure. They eventually met in person when Frank traveled to Ireland, but he didn't stay for long, and they eventually got out of touch with each other. After Titanic met its strange ending, many bottles containing secret messages started to surface. Almost all of them proved to be counterfeited, apart from one letter. Years after Titanic had sunk in the icy Atlantic waters, a bottle was found on the Irish shores. It was supposedly from a man named Jeremiah Burke, and to this day, it is considered to be the only genuine message in a bottle originating from Titanic. The piece of paper simply stated the sender's name and the location, the Titanic, accompanied by the word goodbye. Since the date has washed away, it's difficult to estimate whether the note was sent before or after the ship had hit the iceberg. The common understanding is, however, that since Jeremiah was looking to relocate to the U.S., he was merely sending his last symbolic regards to his family and friends back in Ireland. This simple way of meeting and sometimes corresponding with people has turned into a hobby for a man from a Canadian province named Prince Edward Island, located east of the U.S. state of Maine. This man, Harold Hackett, claims to have sent over 4,000 bottles into the Atlantic Ocean since 1996. He also claims to have received many responses from all over the world, including letters from people in Europe, like France and Germany, but also from the Bahamas or even Africa. This unlikely pastime earns him about 150 Christmas cards from his pen pals each year. To this day, he refuses to add his phone number to any of his letters. This way, he ensures that if people ever want to contact him, the only means of doing so is via a written letter. He's also studied the best times to send the messages in the water based on the direction of the winds and the currents. Now, some bottles spend a whole lifetime at sea after being cast away by their sender. It was the case for a British man that wrote a message and placed it into a bottle before throwing it in the English Channel in 1914. His name was Thomas Hughes, and he wanted to direct the message to his wife, but was polite enough to write a letter to whoever got their hands on the bottle first, asking them to redirect the piece of paper accordingly. The bottle didn't reach his wife, since it was found 85 years later on the Essex coast. The man that stumbled upon the bottle was kind enough to reach out to the family and place the message in possession of Thomas's daughter. And 85 years isn't the longest time for a small bottle to be cruising the waves. A scientist named Hunter Brown was studying currents in the North Sea when this idea came to his mind. He placed the same message in almost 2,000 bottles and requested the unlikely recipient that they write back with the location of their discovery. He thought this method would help him better understand the layout of the North Sea currents. A bottle was found about 11 miles from its original departing location after 97 years. To this day, more than 300 of the original bottles relating to Hunter Brown's project eventually made it to the shore. Not all of the messages that were found in bottles got replied to via physical letters. Oliver van de Walle threw a bottle containing a letter on the English coast while he was on vacation with his family. He was 14 at the time. 33 years later, a woman reached out on Facebook claiming she had gotten his message and tracked him down through his social media profile. At first, he hardly remembered having placed the letter in the bottle, but he eventually recounted the events, even the fact that he sealed the bottle with candle wax to make sure it was leak-proof. And then there's Christina Aguilera and her bottle. No wait, hers is about a genie in a bottle. Okay, never mind. It was the biggest ship ever built in its time, and it was supposed to be unsinkable. But within days of steaming out on its first voyage in 1912, the Titanic was gone, beneath the relentless waves of the North Atlantic Ocean. And of its more than 2,200 passengers and crew, only 706 survived that dreadful night. Would a smaller ship have fared any better in the same situation? Did the size of the iceberg truly matter in the end? Was it a mistake for the ship to change course at the last minute as it tried to avoid impact? These are three questions that have people pondering, what if? We do know that Titanic was considered an engineering marvel in its day. Designed by Thomas Andrews for the British shipping company White Star Line, it was just over 880 feet long and 175 feet tall. Built with abundant space for 840 staterooms, a swimming pool, a squash court, a gym, and 2 dining rooms. But it was below deck that one of its most impressive new features could be found. Titanic's hull was divided into 16 compartments designed to be watertight. Up to 4 of these compartments could take on water in the event of a breach, with the remaining 12 helping to keep the damaged ship afloat. It was thanks to these compartments that the ship was regarded as unsinkable. Rumor has it that Philip Frank, White Star Line's vice president, even declared, "There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." On April 14, 1912, that proved to be mistaken when Titanic struck an iceberg. As ice ripped along the ship's hull, several of those watertight compartments ruptured. It took only 2.5 hours for Titanic to sink. Did the size of the iceberg that hit Titanic seal its fate? Would a bigger or smaller iceberg have made any difference? Icebergs come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. They are pieces of ice that have broken away from glaciers or ice shelves in the Arctic and Antarctic, and are now wandering across the ocean until they eventually melt. One of the tallest icebergs ever found would have easily dwarfed Titanic. Discovered in 1957, it was 550 feet high. That's close to the height of the Washington Monument. Imagine ramming into something that big. Smaller icebergs, though, can turn out just as dangerous. Some are the size of houses and called bergy bits. Others, closer to the size of a car, are called growlers. These can be much harder for ships and boats to locate, making them more difficult to avoid. And though smaller, they can produce a lot of damage when hit. It's also critical to recall that icebergs are always bigger than they seem, with the majority of their mass lurking below the ocean surface. In fact, over 80% of an iceberg's volume is underwater. Most of its sharp, jagged edges cannot be seen. Roam too close, and you risk damaging your ship's hull. Because Titanic had little notice of its impending doom, a smaller iceberg, struck at the same angle, could still have been enough to bring that mighty ship down. Now, it's possible that had the iceberg been larger, it would have been spotted sooner. Titanic might have had time to alter course and avoid the impact. But missing that one iceberg would not have guaranteed Titanic's safety. It was traveling in a dangerous stretch of the Atlantic called Iceberg Alley. It's located 250 miles east and southeast of Newfoundland, Canada. Behind one iceberg, there could be another, and another after that. And so the crew on board had to remain very attentive to avoid several potential collisions, not just one. A smaller ship might have been better suited for the trip. Titanic's size was certainly a challenge when it came to steering. In fact, it had just left her dock in Southampton when it nearly collided with another smaller ocean liner, the SS New York, missing it by just 2 feet. The gigantic steamship was obviously not made for maneuvering quickly in tight quarters. A ship that size required time and space to change course. But when it comes to ships versus icebergs, a ship's size doesn't always matter. The Islander was a steamship designed to travel the Inside Passage in Alaska. In the summer of 1901, it struck an iceberg, which tore a hole in the front portion or bow of the ship. The vessel did not sink right away, and the crew tried to steer it to safety. Ultimately, its bow completely submerged, and its stern was lifted up and out of the water. It didn't take much longer before the ship sank completely. Of the 168 passengers and crew members, 128 survived, and $3 million in gold was lost. Islander had a 240-foot hull, making it almost a quarter of the size of Titanic, and that smaller size didn't seem to be much help in preventing a collision with an iceberg. And then there was the Hans Hedtoft in 1959. Also known as the Little Titanic or the Danish Titanic, it was referred to as the safest ship afloat. It was 272 feet long with 95 people on board. Much like the real Titanic, the Hans Hedtoft was specifically engineered to handle most of what the sea could throw its way. Along with its double steel bottom, it also had an armored bow and 7 watertight compartments. How could such a ship sink? But it could, and it did. It was on its first voyage, returning to Copenhagen, when it ran into trouble. On January 30th, it hit an iceberg. An SOS was sent, but when the Johannes Cross arrived to help, the Hans Hedtoft was nowhere to be found. The only evidence of the ship's existence was a lifebelt that was washed ashore in Iceland 9 months later. Again, the ship's smaller size didn't work in its favor. A smaller size of Titanic wouldn't have guaranteed a safe voyage in 1912. The final what-if concerns the last-minute choice when the iceberg was spotted and the alarm sounded. First, Titanic could attempt a complete stop, but this wasn't an option as the ship needed a half a mile to come to a halt, and the iceberg was a mere 900 feet away. Second, the Titanic could attempt to avoid the iceberg by steering away from it. This is what the captain ordered, but the attempt was unsuccessful, resulting in a deep gash across the ship's hull. The final option? To hit the iceberg head-on. Would this have made any difference? The answer is an intriguing maybe. Some think a head-on collision would have saved Titanic. In this scenario, the collision would have limited the damage to the very front of the ship. Instead of the iceberg tearing through the hull and compromising several of the watertight compartments, only 4 of the compartments would have been breached. This meant the others could do their job of keeping Titanic afloat. The ship could be stuck, unable to move, but it would remain above water until help arrived. This would provide a ship like Carpathia enough time to reach the scene of the accident and bring the people on board to safety. One of the Titanic's designers, Edward Wilding, made a similar claim during an inquiry into the sinking. He argued that most people would have survived a head-on crash, and that Titanic itself would not have sunk. Others disagree, though. First, the special bulkheads on Titanic were designed specifically to protect the ship against collisions with other vessels, not with icebergs. These compartments would crumple upon impact, absorbing some of the force while the other ship absorbed the rest. Though the damage would still be extensive, the remaining bulkheads would keep the ship afloat. But an iceberg does not have the same flex in a collision as you would experience with another ship. Most of the force would be absorbed by Titanic, resulting in greater damage to the ship. Even worse, the impact would be carried through the full length of the ship. Rivets would burst, seams would tear, the compartments would quickly flood, and the ship would sink even faster, resulting in fewer survivors. In any case, as with most what-ifs, we'll never really know the answer. As tragic as Titanic's first and last voyage was, it did result in changes that helped make venturing out to sea much safer. Findings from hearings on the disaster led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, or ICC, in 1914, an organization that tracks icebergs in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans to ensure vessels in the area can avoid them. In the US and Britain, ships were obligated to carry enough lifeboats to accommodate every person aboard. Regular lifeboat drills were made mandatory. And finally, the bulkheads on ships were made higher to keep water out, and bottoms were stretched to create double hulls, helping make the compartments truly waterproof. There's no denying that Titanic was a terrible tragedy, but the lessons learned from that night to remember has helped prevent many more.
Over a century ago, The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Of the 2,240 people on board, only around 700 survived. Since then, the tragedy has been the subject of endless movies, documentaries, and books. And though we've learned a lot about the ship and many of the people on board, we hardly know anything about the iceberg responsible for the catastrophe, especially anything concerning its size. But maybe we can find some clues. The Titanic was constructed by the White Star Line as part of its new fleet of passenger liners. At the time, it was the largest ship ever built, and it lived up to its name. The ship was 883 feet long, equal to 2.5 soccer fields placed end to end, and 175 feet tall, which is close to 10 giraffes standing on top of one another. From the waterline to the deck alone, the boat was 60 feet high. That's close to the height of a 4-story building. The Titanic was big enough to have veranda cafes, a restaurant, a reading and writing room, a Turkish bath, a gym, and squash courts. There was even space for a swimming pool. The liner could carry a total of 3,300 people, including 2,435 passengers and 900 crew members. Although luxury was important, safety was paramount. The Titanic had been designed to have 16 watertight compartments below its deck. If the ship's hull was somehow compromised in an accident, up to 4 of these compartments could take on the water, while the remaining 12 would keep the ship afloat. Philip Franklin, vice president of the White Star Line, said this was what made the ship truly remarkable. It's believed that the man said, "There is no danger the Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." He was so very wrong. The ship left England for its first and last voyage on April 10, 1912. And all it took was a single iceberg to bring that mighty vessel down. Icebergs are fascinating. They are formed during a process called calving, when large chunks of freshwater ice break free from glaciers and float away into open water. They eventually melt away and disappear. In the northern hemisphere, the majority of these icebergs come from Greenland. In the south, they come from Antarctica. What you see on top of the water is only a small portion of an iceberg. This is just the tip. Most of it, up to 90%, is hidden under the water. Only when you examine pictures of the entire thing can you truly appreciate how massive icebergs are. It's the part of the iceberg you can't see that is often the most dangerous. Beneath the waves, it can have jagged edges in random places. A ship can easily get too close without realizing it, resulting in serious damage to the bottom of the boat. And it's not just big icebergs you have to watch out for. Smaller ones, which are more difficult to spot, can prove to be just as dangerous. A growler, for example, is under 7 feet long, with just a bit more than 3 feet showing above the water. And a slightly larger bergy bit is less than 15 feet in size. The dangers of icebergs were well known when the Titanic set sail. In 1901, the Islander was traveling through the Inside Passage to Alaska. It collided with an iceberg and sank immediately. Luckily, 138 of the 178 people on board made it to safety. Back then, there wasn't any special equipment for detecting icebergs. The best tool was your eyes. From a special vantage point above the ship called the crow's nest, 2 members of the crew had to stare out over the ocean and watch for potential hazards. The crow's nest was located at the front of the ship, 49 feet above the deck. It was attached to the mast. From this height, a person had a good view of the ocean. If they saw anything suspicious, they could ring a large bell to sound the alarm. After that, they could call from a special telephone to warn the captain of any danger. But imagine what a horrible job this would have been, especially on the night the Titanic sank. The crow's nest wasn't a warm and cozy room surrounded by windows. Instead, it was a large open tub exposed to the elements. On April 14, 1912, the air temperature was around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, which is close to freezing. With the ship moving at about 23 knots, more than 26 miles per hour, the sailors must have felt that frigid cold air pressing against any exposed skin. The only good thing about the job was that the shift only lasted 2 hours. Frederick Fleet was the sailor who actually spotted the iceberg that sank the Titanic. He was up in the crow's nest, working with Reginald Lee at the time. Fleet kept track of the left side of the ship, while Lee scanned the right. It was 10 p.m. when the two men started their shift. They had already been warned about the possibility of ice. But when you're cold and it's dark, it might feel like an impossible task. Even worse, the two men didn't even have binoculars to make the job any easier. Fleet would later insist that having binoculars would have prevented the tragedy. With about 20 minutes remaining on the job, the sailors noticed the iceberg. Fleet rang the bell, once, twice, and again. He then called up to the bridge to inform the crew. At first, the call seemed to come in the nick of time. The ship's engines reversed, and the massive ocean liner managed to turn. It wasn't enough to miss the iceberg, though. Ice showered down onto the ship's deck. The iceberg tore through the hull, and water flooded in. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the Titanic was gone. And here we have clue number 1. The iceberg was big enough to be spotted with the unaided eye in the dark of the night without any binoculars. It was also tall enough for bits of ice to fall down onto the ship's deck. Since this all took place long before social media and smartphones, nobody on board would have been taking photos or videos at the time. So, of course, we don't have any footage of the actual iceberg. But there are photos of the possible iceberg from later that day. The SS Prinz Adalbert was sailing near the area on the morning of April 15, 1912. The steward on the ship had not yet heard about what had happened to the Titanic. But when he spotted an iceberg floating by, he was compelled to photograph it. Why? There was a line of red paint along the bottom of the iceberg, indicating that it had likely collided with a ship sometime within the previous 12 hours. A second photo was taken from a ship called the Minia, which was sent into the area to look for debris from the collision. Captain de Carteret said that among the wreckage, he had seen only one iceberg. He also noticed a streak of red paint on it. From the photos and witness accounts, newspaper reports estimated the iceberg to be 50 to 100 feet high and 200 to 400 feet long. That's clue number 2. The iceberg that hit the Titanic probably started its ocean journey from Greenland's coast, heading past the Baffin Bay to the Davis Strait. From here, it must have slipped through the Labrador Sea and finally reached the Atlantic. And that, in itself, is pretty impressive. The glaciers in Greenland create between 15,000 to 30,000 icebergs each year. Some small, some big. Of these, a mere 1% will actually make it to the Atlantic. The others simply melt along the way. We know that the temperature of the Atlantic Ocean, where the sinking took place, was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That's below freezing. For humans, this could cause frostbite or hypothermia. But that temperature is actually warm for an iceberg. Most would only last 2 to 3 years in the North Atlantic, slowly melting into the warmer water. Based on this, it's likely that the Titanic's iceberg left Greenland in 1910 or 1911 and was fully melted by late 1912 or 1913. But since it did make it to the Atlantic and managed to cause significant damage to the ship, we have clue number 3. We will never know for certain the size of the iceberg from that day, but we do know that it definitely wasn't a growler or a bergy bit. Both those types of icebergs are much too small. And if the ice was indeed scattered across the deck during the collision, the iceberg must have been a little taller than 60 feet. The newspaper estimates are probably as close as we're going to get. The iceberg that took down the Titanic was indeed a formidable one. And icebergs are still a threat. As recently as 2007, the cruise ship Explorer struck one and sank in Antarctica's Weddell Sea. Luckily, everybody survived. The International Ice Patrol was created in 1914 following the Titanic's sinking. The organization is still in operation today, made up of representatives from several countries. Using airplanes and radar, the patrol locates and tracks larger icebergs, making the information available to anyone who needs it and preventing more ocean tragedies in the process.
Titanic sank on April 14, 1912, and all of the passengers' belongings and ship's paraphernalia went down into the deep, dark waters with it. These objects patiently waited to be discovered until 1985. Titanic sank fast, and there seemed to be almost nothing left from the ship. Yet divers in small submarines managed to retrieve plenty of artifacts from the wreckage. If you wonder what those surprising items look like, hey, join me. A number of museums have collections of Titanic items rescued by divers or donated by survivors and their relatives. And some of those items are even sold at auction. So if you're ready to spend a pretty penny on an exclusive artifact, hey, why not? The first artifact on my list is a pocket watch belonging to a Titanic passenger, John Chapman. John and his wife Elizabeth were on their honeymoon. When the ship hit the iceberg, Elizabeth was offered a seat on a lifeboat next to her friend Emily Richards. There was a problem, though. Mr. Chapman couldn't enter the lifeboat. Elizabeth turned to her friend Emily and said, "Farewell. If John can't go, I won't go either." Now, that's what I call true love. After a short time, the ship went under. If we step back and return to Chapman's pocket watch, we'll notice one more heartbreaking detail. Experts believe the watch stopped around the time the ship finally submerged. Do you remember the iconic scene in the Titanic movie where the ship's band continued to play while the ship was sinking? The violin, played by the real musician, was sold in an auction for $1.7 million in 2013. They say the band played "Nearer My God to Thee" as the ocean liner sank. Since we started talking about the band, we might as well shed light on a piece of music found on the ship. It was the song "Put Your Arms Around Me, Honey." Considering the fact that paper gets ruined almost instantly when it meets with water, it's a miracle to see those documents. Another saved paper document is the lunch menu. The first-class passengers wore their beautiful dresses and enjoyed their meals without knowing that it was their last lunch. This unique item was auctioned for $122,000. Meals were offered based on class. For instance, a first-class passenger would eat roasted turkey with cranberry sauce, spring lamb, or baked haddock. In comparison, a third-class lunch consists of stuff like rice soup, fresh bread, roast beef, and brown gravy. There were also cabin biscuits, which the passengers would eat to diminish seasickness. It wasn't just the menu. A VIP ticket was also retrieved. The ticket number is still readable, 1342. Number 5 is Edwardian perfume samples. A chemist named Adolf Saalfeld stepped onto the Titanic with various perfume bottle samples. Why did he bring these samples with him? Well, Saalfeld planned to open a fragrance store in America. 61 vials of perfume sank with the ship. Luckily, their owner managed to survive and get there safely, but his samples sank and were only rediscovered some time ago by the divers. When we accidentally drop a plate, it usually shatters into pieces. Now, there's a question. Do you think an unbroken plate can be recovered from Titanic? The answer is yes. Original White Star tableware is proof. Apparently, each class of passengers didn't just get different meals, but was also served with different types of plates. The retrieved plates have a green and brown floral motif. The edges have a gold rim, and there's a logo in the center. By the way, they're sold at auction, and you can find them online. Let's carry on with touching personal stories. The love story of Rose and Jack that we see in the movie is fictional, but the ship surely witnessed many romantic tales. Here's a love letter to prove this. The messages tell us a story about how life was on the ship during the last few days. It was written by Kate Buss on April 10th. She mentioned how seasick she felt and other things, such as she was supposed to go to dinner in a half an hour. This letter wasn't the only letter divers took to the surface. For example, there's the letter Esther Hart wrote to her little daughter, Ava. It was sold at auction for £119,000. This letter is probably the last letter written on board, since it was completed only 8 hours before the tragedy. The letter is not that damaged because it was in the pocket of Esther's husband's coat. Another letter we can mention is Dr. John Simpson's letter. Those words were the last words that he wrote to his mother. Let me introduce you to Edith Rosenbaum. She was on the ship with her lucky toy pig. Edith had been severely injured in an accident before she sailed on the big ship. The toy was a present from her mother as moral support for her recuperation process. It was actually a music box in the shape of a pig. Edith used it to calm frightened young people in the same lifeboat. The next item on the list is the scout whistle of Lillian Bentham. She was a second-class passenger. On that terrible night, Lillian was in her stateroom. She didn't believe that the Titanic could sink. After all, it was the unsinkable ship. Her friend came to her and convinced her to hop into a lifeboat. Only then did she realize how serious the situation was. Moments later, she saw the ship break into two parts. As the lifeboat floated into the night, Lillian saw a crewman who was also rescued. Without a second thought, she wrapped the man with her fur coat. It was freezing, so she probably saved the man's life by doing that. The young man wanted to thank her for her kindness, so he gave Lillian a scout whistle. It was the whistle he used throughout the night to call for help. This pair of white gloves is one of the rarest artifacts recovered from Titanic. These cotton gloves belong to a gentleman. The owner's identity is unknown. Fabric can't last underwater for decades, but these gloves look fine, and you can still see the fine detailing and elegance. An alarm bell has also been found. Yes, that's the famous bell, the one that rang to warn people about the iceberg. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were on lookout duty the night of the accident. Both of them survived. Fleet was the one who saw the iceberg before the ship struck it. What's ironic is that Fleet and Lee